Help support Name Explain by liking this video, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. When it comes to languages spoken in North America, I'm sure one language comes to mind for most of us, that being English. English is spoken widely by so many across the continent of North America, whether that be as someone's first language or as their second or third or so on. In fact, across all of North America there are believed to be 370 million speakers of the language. That's more English speakers in North America than there are English people in England. Though despite how universal English may seem in North America, to presume that no other languages are spoken on the continent would be a huge disservice. Through the indigenous people of these lands and the history of settlement that's taken place on the continent, many languages have made themselves at home, from Canada to Panama and all the land in between. Of course, while Central America is seen as its own thing, it is still also seen as part of North America, and in these lands Spanish is the primary language of choice. And of course we can't forget about the native languages spoken in the land too, like Nahuatl and Navajo. However, the language of most interest, for us today anyway, is the one that has made itself quite comfortably at home in North America's most northern nation, Canada. And yes, I know Greenland is more northern than Canada and is seen as part of North America, but for the sake of the previously used illustration, let's just pretend Greenland doesn't exist for a moment. Anyway, while like with the United States of America, English is the predominant language of the land of moose and maple syrup. However, if you check Wikipedia, you will notice that Canada actually has two official languages, English and French. Canada's population sits around the 37 million mark, and I read that 7.2 million of those residents have French as their native tongue, which is around 20% of the Canadian population, so that's quite a large amount of native speakers. This isn't just one odd commune of people speaking a language, like Welsh in Argentina. This means that French is pretty present in the country, from roadsides being bilingual and legislation and laws having to be written in both languages. Many Canadians are fluent in both languages too, or at least have a good understanding of the language that isn't native to them. However, these are just stats and facts I'm reading off the internet. If you are Canadian / live in Canada, then I'd love to hear the realities of the situation. Is French really as entrenched as many of us outside the nation think it is? Though regardless of how much French is really spoken in the country, French is still spoken in the country. And of course the question on my mind is simply, why? We all seem to know the stories of how European settlement in these lands led to English and Spanish becoming the first and second most popular languages respectively on the continent, but how did North America's third most popular language, French, end up in Canada? Well, once again, this is a story of European settlement. France is very much tied into the history of Canada. In fact, we have the misunderstanding of a Frenchman to thank for the name of the nation itself. This Frenchman being explorer Jacques Cartier. In 1534, he set sail to find a more direct route to Asia, and from this he reached the shores of what would become Newfoundland. It was he who tried to claim the land for France initially, but it didn't really work out for him. However, as we mentioned, he did have a lasting impact on the country. When he met with local tribes in the land, they called their village Kanata, which was simply their word for village. However, Cartier mistook this as being their word for the land as a whole, so mistakenly called all this land Kanata, which over time evolved into Canada. It's a fun story and we have a whole video about it on the channel, so go check it out. Though, as I mentioned, despite naming the nation, he didn't really claim any land for France. That wouldn't happen until the 17th century, when Frenchman Samuel du Champlain founded the colony of Acadia, which equates roughly to modern-day New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and perhaps more importantly, Quebec City, which would become the capital of France's North American settlement, which would aptly be named New France. New France kept on expanding and even reached outside of Canada into what would become the United States of America. At its peak, New France stretched from the Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. New France, however, came to a bit of an abrupt end in the 18th century, and that's because a certain other nation felt that the French were claiming too much land in the New World, and this of course was the British. This anger over land between France and Britain led to a series of wars and treaties. Of course, the British were successful in many of these wars, as much of Canada and New France came into British rule. I mean, the Queen is still on Canadian money to this day, and it seems that because of this British claim on the land, as well as the United States gaining independence in 1776, New France was dissolved and came to an end in 1763. However, France would still have some control in these lands. By the late 18th century, the people of Canada wanted independence from the French and the British, and by 1867, the Dominion of Canada was established, with two distinctive provinces, Upper Canada and Lower Canada. What made these so distinctive? Well, Upper Canada was predominantly English speaking, and is to this day, becoming the modern day province of Ontario, and Lower Canada was predominantly French speaking, as it is to this day too, becoming the modern province of Quebec. The formation of the Dominion of Canada created the pathway for the modern nation of Canada, and while the French may no longer have any rule over Canada, their language has been left in the lands, as a reminder of the nation's history, hence why French is spoken in Canada. However, as I mentioned, the French rule in North America expanded way outside of just Canada. For some time, France laid claim to much of what will become the lands belonging to the United States. So if they were both ruled by France for a time, why isn't this French influence as commonplace in the USA as it is in Canada? Well, it kind of is. It's just that the French influence in the USA isn't nationwide, with it being more isolated to a single state. But this is also a very similar case to Canada, as they have one primarily French state too, which I've already mentioned and will mention more as this video progresses. So what is the Frenchest state of the USA? Well, that title of course belongs to the state of Louisiana. The large chunk of the modern USA that the French claimed was called Louisiana in honor of the French king at the time, King Louis XIV. While this land did include the modern state of Louisiana, it went way beyond that. It basically covered much of the land around the Mississippi River. This land area actually exchanged ownership between the French and the Spanish over its history, being controlled by the French between 1682 to 1763 and 1801 to 1803. Of course, it was in 1803 that the Louisiana Purchase famously took place. This was when Napoleon Bonaparte sold the French land to Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States at that time, in turn making these former French lands American and expanding the United States into the massive nation that it would become. And while this land may have become American, some French influences remained, most noticeably in the state that now goes by the name of this former French province, Louisiana. The French inspiration can be seen all across the state, especially with their city of New Orleans, from that name to the architecture of the city to the culture of the city. Hey, even has a part known as the French Quarter, for crying out loud. New Orleans is a very French city, and that's because of the history that has played out there. Though we aren't really interested in French culture in the USA today, but more French language. So where is it? Well, it's with the Cajun people of Louisiana. You may have heard of Cajuns, even if it's just as a spice on chicken. However, there are way more to them than just that. The name for these people comes from a dialect pronunciation of Arcadia, another French colony in Canada, as we mentioned earlier. When the British took over the French controlled parts of Canada, many of the French people there had to disperse. Many exiled down to Louisiana and New Orleans due to its French history. Many of these people settled in the bayous and swamps near to New Orleans, forming communities and living in the traditional way they did up in Canada, and this formed that modern concept of Cajun people we have to this day. Though it must be remembered that that stereotype of Cajun people I just mentioned doesn't apply to all Cajun people. That would be silly. Also, quick side note, we also have the Creole people in New Orleans too. Sometimes the Cajun and Creole people are seen as one and the same, and sometimes they're seen as different peoples altogether. It seems the key difference between the two is that Cajuns are descendants of French settlers, while Creole are descendants of those born into the French and Spanish colonies. There's way more to it than that, but it's a bit too off topic for this video. I'm sure someone in the comments will tell us more about them. Anyway, what's of most interest about the Cajun people to us today is how they speak. To this day, a variation of French called Louisiana French is spoken by the Cajun and Creole people. In fact, Wikipedia claims that there were between 150,000 to 200,000 native speakers of this version of French, in 2012 at least. On top of this, there's also Cajun English, a dialect of English heavily inspired by Louisiana French, once again spoken by the Cajun people of New Orleans. So from France via Canada, French is spoken in the United States, just a very unique form of the language. It seems the biggest issue that New France and the French claim on North America in general faced was population. Even though France's reach in the New World was vast, it was sparsely populated, with the biggest population being up in Quebec. This created challenges for the French. When it came to wars for the land, the French simply didn't have enough soldiers, and this lack of people must have made it difficult for the French language to spread across their land, especially compared compared to how many English speakers there were too. It was able to spread significantly in the region of Quebec where the French set up their base of operation in North America. However, beyond that, it just didn't massively take off. Hence why French isn't as widely spoken in the USA as it is in Canada, despite both being under French rule in the past. Though I hear you asking, was any of this got to do with names? This is name explain after all, and well, in all honesty, not a whole lot. Sometimes I just like talking about language in general as opposed to focusing on names and etymology. However, going back to the initial country this video was supposed to be focusing on, Canada, this French and British history has had an interesting effect on the names of the settlements in the country, most noticeably in Quebec. As mentioned, Quebec was the central hub for New France and the French in North America, and while Quebec's name is of Algonquin origin meaning narrow strait, many of the settlements in the region have distinctively French names. Take the name of Quebec's largest city, Montreal. This comes from French and means Mount Royal. Beyond the big city, there are many other French settlement names in the province, like Le Tuc, Saint-Guillaume, and Du Montagne. I won't be going into where exactly these names come from, but I'm sure you can see just how many French names there are in the land. Though of course the land came under British rule, meaning some settlements here have British-based names. The city of Sherbrooke in Quebec is named after British General Sir John Sherbrooke. Drummondville is too a British name, and this city was even set up as a home for British soldiers. And unsurprisingly, Scottstown in Quebec was named after its Scottish settlers. And as I mentioned, there are native names still here too, like with the name Quebec itself being Algonquin. It's safe to say that the province of Quebec and the French and British names of its settlements can really give us a clear view into the history of Canada as a whole. They give us a window into what people and languages have graced the land, and still do to this day. You know what? Sometimes a nation's history can be best seen in their names, and this is most certainly the case for the French language in Canada. To understand the etymology of Antarctica, we first need to understand where the name Arctic comes from, as despite these two places literally being as far away from each other as possible, their names are closely tied. The name of the Arctic comes from the Greek Arctikos, which means of the constellation of the bear, which references Ursa Major, a constellation supposedly bear-shaped that resides above the Arctic. We can see the name of the Arctic within Antarctica. So what does the ant part at the start mean? Well, no, this doesn't reference the fact that there are many ants on the continent. In fact, from what I could tell, unsurprisingly there aren't any ants native to Antarctica. This ant part comes from Greek and means opposite. Of course, we still see this quite often in language with the prefix anti meaning opposite of something. The ant in Antarctica comes from this Greek anti prefix. In fact, if they included the I and called the continent Anti-Arctic, then this name really does start to make sense, as Antarctica is the complete opposite of the Arctic. Flash forward from this coining of the name to now, and Antarctica has a population of around 1,000 people over the summer months and around 200 during the winter. So it's safe to say that despite how we humans have been able to make pretty much every on Earth habitable, society on this continent never really took off. But nevertheless, there are people living here, which in itself is still rather impressive. And of course, these people have to get on with each other and communicate with one another. So that got me thinking, what language do they speak? Is there an official language of Antarctica? Well, no. Antarctica really is that barren. The people who live there now aren't the remnants of an ancient tribe we haven't made contact with yet. There isn't any group of people like that in Antarctica. The closest the continent has to an indigenous people are penguins. There really isn't some sort of Antarcticese language, I'm afraid. So who are the people living in Antarctica? On the whole, they are scientists and researchers based on the continent studying this barren land. Of course, these research bases are populated by many people from around the world, with these people bringing their own languages. The current state of Antarctica is pretty odd, to say the least. It's kind of in a state of being claimed and not being claimed. If you look at a map of Antarctica, you'll see that it's split up from the centre, kind of like a pie chart, with various countries having claims to various parts of the land. However, it's also been decreed that Antarctica belongs to all of us. It's a weird state of existence, and better people than myself have explained it better. Though if we ignore this for now, we can see on a map that the continent is split up with claims from the nations of France, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Chile, and Argentina, with the Chilean and Argentine claims weirdly overlapping. Like I said, it's a bit confusing. However, you will also notice that one huge chunk of the continent is completely unclaimed. This is the Marie Byrd Land. This is the single largest unclaimed and uninhabited place on Earth, so if you want some land for yourself, go get it, though I can't imagine you'll be living the most pleasant life there. Richard E. Byrd led a flight over the area in 1929, and upon spotting it, he named it after his wife, Marie Byrd, which I'm sure he meant as a nice gesture, but naming a huge uninhabited wasteland after your wife? I don't know, maybe they had some marital issues. Nevertheless, as this land has remained uninhabited, no one else has bothered giving it a new name. Anyway, let's go back to the parts of the continent that are claimed by other nations. We have parts of Antarctica claimed by France, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Chile, and Argentina. Now, this is really an eclectic group of countries. France and the UK were known for claiming as much land as possible back in the day, like a mad game on Monopoly, so I can understand why they would make claims in the continent. Norway were actually the first to reach the South Pole, so that's why they have a claim to the land. Though I imagine coming from Norway to Antarctica must be quite the trip. Of course, New Zealand and Australia have ties with the UK, and due to their location on the globe, it makes sense for them to have claims there too. Same with Chile and Argentina. They aren't countries I personally normally associate with claiming random land, but I forget just how close these countries are to Antarctica. So, what name did these nations bestow to their claims of Antarctica? Well, unfortunately, on the whole, they aren't really at all that fun. The majority of them are just named after the nations who claimed them. We have the British Antarctic Territory, the Australian Antarctic Territory, the Chilean Antarctic Territory, and Argentine Antarctica. I'm not gonna lie, that's pretty inconsiderate of them, especially for those of us who like talking about names. However, they weren't all this rude. France, New Zealand, and Norway were nice enough to give their Atlantic claims unique names. The French part of Antarctica is called Adélie Land. This land was discovered by French explorer Jules de Montdurville, and he too named it after his wife, Adélie de Montdurville. Geez, what is it with these men naming cold, desolate places after their wives? Go get some marriage counselling, guys. New Zealand's Ross Dependency on Antarctica is named after the British explorer James Clark Ross, and of course the Ross Sea that lies next to the Ross Dependency is named after this man too. And once again, the Norwegian claim in Antarctica is named after someone too, being called Queen Maud Land, unsurprisingly being named after Queen Maud of Norway, who of course was someone's wife. This is the geographic breakdown of Antarctica, and with this we should start to be able to understand what languages they speak on the continent, and the short answer is a lot. As I mentioned, the people living here are scientists and researchers from these nations who have claimed the land. It appears that English is the most popular spoken language of Antarctica. This is due to the fact that the UK, New Zealand and Australia all have claimed lands on the continent, all of which speak English. Plus, English is also the international language of science, and everyone in Antarctica are there for scientific reasons, so that would explain why they speak so much English too. However, it isn't just English on the continent. Thanks to Chile's and Argentina's claims, it means that Spanish is spoken there too, as is of course French and Norwegian, due to these being the other nations that have claims on the land. And what's really cool about this is that all these languages are reflected in the names of the research stations in Antarctica. Each station is run by a specific nation, and of course they all have names. We definitely won't go into all these names, but we have things like the French-run stations like de Montdurville, named after the aforementioned French explorer whose wife lent her name to the whole French claim. The Argentine Camara base, named after naval aviator Juan Ramon Camara. The Australian Mawson station, named after Australian geologist Douglas Mawson. The Chilean Arturo Prat station, named after Chilean naval officer Arturo Prat. A New Zealand base called Scott Base, named after the Navy officer Robert Falcon Scott, who wasn't a Kiwi but played a large role in Antarctica. And really creatively, there's a Norwegian base called Troll, named after some nearby mountains that reminded them of trolls of Norwegian mythology. These names are really fun and interesting, but the UK decided to be boring and named their stations Station A, Station B, Station C, and so on. So that's already 4 languages that are spoken between these 7 nations that have claimed to Antarctica: French, Norwegian, Spanish for Chile and Argentina, and English for the UK, Australia and New Zealand. That's already quite the variety of languages to be shared between little more than 1,000 people. However, there are even more languages on the continent. Remember how I was saying how even though these 7 countries have claims to the land in the Antarctic, the continent is also considered to be for everyone? This means that other nations can have research stations with the land claimed by other countries, and of course these countries can give their bases names that derive from their own languages too. So the countries with bases in Antarctica, as well as the 7 we've already mentioned, are Belarus, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, China, Czechia, Germany, Ecuador, Finland, India, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Peru, Poland, Romania, Russia, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Ukraine, the USA and Uruguay. This, by my calculation, means there are 31 different countries with stations in Antarctica, with roughly 21 different languages being spoken between them. Though I only included the main language of nations that have multiple languages, so there very well could be more. Honestly, I find this absolutely crazy. Despite how few people there are in this massive land, there are so many languages being spoken here. In fact, it might possibly have the largest variation of languages anywhere in the world when compared to population, which really isn't too shabby for a place with little more than some snow and penguins. However, this got me thinking, with this huge variety of languages, would it be possible if somehow they merged and formed some sort of native Antarctic language? Well, probably not. I haven't been there myself, but I imagine people from various bases with various languages don't intermix that much. I don't think there's a pub they could all meet at, and a lot of the researchers aren't based there for a long enough time for a new language to form, which really sucks. Perhaps we could dump a load of people with a variety of languages in Antarctica, leave them a few generations, and see if they come up with a new language. Or maybe not. That sounds a bit inhumane now that I've said it out loud. Though, despite what I've just said, there actually is a kind of language that has originated from Antarctica. Well, sort of. This is the slang and jargon that those who are based in Antarctica have come up with over the years. There's actually quite a lot of them and they're really fascinating. There'll be a link to them all down below, so go check them out when you can. Some of my favourites are Gumball, which is the name for when snow clumps up into your facial hair, Thingy, a name for a new person on the continent, coming from a pronunciation of FNG. We aren't too sure what the F stands for, but the N and G stands for new guy/girl. A Dear John, which is a letter from a partner not in Antarctica. Cheech, which is the shortening of Christchurch where many fly to get on and off Antarctica. Beaker, a name for an unpopular scientist. The Muppet fans in the room will appreciate that one. Bolo, meaning burnt out, left over for someone who has been there too long. Ice wife/ice husband, the name for someone you get very familiar with while in Antarctica, even if you're already accounted for outside the continent. And green out, the emotion felt when seeing or smelling green things again after being in Antarctica. Even at literally the bottom of the earth, people are still able to create new language, which I think is amazing. From our first migrations out of Africa to the colonization of pretty much every corner of our planet, we humans love to move around the globe. When we go on grand migrations like this, we take a lot of things with us. Not only do we bring ourselves and our belongings, but we also take our cultures, ideas, and most importantly for today, our languages. Languages settle and take a firm grasp in the land just as much as the people themselves do. So much of our modern world and the languages spoken across it come from migration and settlement. Take English in example, which has become the dominant language of North America, or even how French has become the lingua franca in many African nations. The resettlement of languages, however, aren't always this grand. Sometimes a language confines itself to just a small pocket of a modern nation. Take the French spoken in parts of Canada, or even the German spoken in Texas. Though today we're looking into one of the strangest cases of a language settling somewhere else on the planet, and that's with the Welsh-speaking community of Argentina. Argentina is a truly fascinating country. It is around 2.8 million square kilometers in size and has a population of almost 45 million. It's also an incredibly biodiverse country, with geography ranging from snowy mountains, dense jungle, to many lakes and rivers. This means a huge variety of wildlife called the nation home to, from penguins to jaguars. While Spanish is the national language of the nation, many other native tongues are spoken there too. It really is an incredibly diverse nation. Wales, on the other hand, is a little bit less dramatic. Well, it's still dramatic in its own way, I suppose. Of course, Wales is one of the home nations of the United Kingdom, meaning it kind of is and isn't a country. I'm sure you know by now how the UK works. Wales is around just 20,000 kilometers square in size, and has a population of just over 3 million, so definitely not quite as large as Argentina. Unlike Argentina, it doesn't have quite as many languages either, just Welsh and English. While its geography is not as diverse, Wales is still incredibly breathtaking. Its natural landscape is beyond picturesque. If you have an image of stereotypical rural England in your mind, you are probably more likely to find something like that in Wales than in England itself. In regards to animals, well, while it may not have jaguars or penguins, they have sheep, almost 10 million sheep to be precise. These two countries are really incredible in their own right, though they're also incredibly different. Yet there is that one thing we know these nations both have in common, and that similarity starts to appear as you venture into the south of Argentina, into the famous region of Patagonia, and in the Chubut province you will find a truly unexpected sight. That sight being a handful of towns and settlements where not only is Welsh spoken, but many of the signs around the town will be written in Welsh. You also see many quintessentially Welsh things like tea rooms selling the incredibly Welsh Ballon Blyth cake. It really is a little slice of Wales tucked away in the southern hemisphere. The Welsh settlements of Argentina are collectively known as Wladfa, which translates into English into meaning the colony. It is also known as Wladfa Golemeg, meaning the Welsh settlement. Hopefully that's the only actual Welsh I have to pronounce in this video. This Welsh colonization even have their own flag, which is a wonderful hybrid of the two nations' flags. The light blue and white stripes of Argentina with the Welsh dragon firmly in the middle instead of that pouting sun. How on earth did Welsh, out of every possible language on our planet, end up making itself at home roughly 11,000 kilometers away in the depths of South America? Well, to understand this, we need to have a good idea of the history of the Welsh language itself. It's been spoken on the island of Britain for an incredibly long time. It's thought to date back to around 600 BC. Welsh is a Celtic language, but not quite like Irish or Scottish Celtic. Those Welsh languages are Goidelic. Welsh is a brythonic Celtic language, meaning it has more in common with Cornish and Breton than Irish and Scottish. We have covered Welsh quite a lot in the past in various videos. If you have watched them, then you will know that Welsh is an incredibly unique language in the way it sounds and how it's spoken. It's very different to the other languages spoken on the island of Great Britain, even compared to its linguistically similar neighbour of Cornish. While we now celebrate the uniqueness of Welsh, that hasn't always been the case. In the past, most people had the same reaction to things that were different to what they were used to, and that reaction was to get rid of it. Welsh seems to have been deeply discriminated against throughout history. In example, King Henry VIII in the 16th century deemed that only English was to be spoken in the courts of Wales, and in the 19th century, a report was published that stigmatised Wales and the Welsh language even further. Wales was seen as a backwards part of the UK when compared to the English-speaking parts of the nation. The stigma on the language made the Welsh tongue decline even further in overall speakers. It wasn't only the Welsh language that started to decline in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution across Britain left much of rural Wales barren. The mining and industry that started to sprout up all across Wales struck fear into many proud Welshmen. They were worried that the Wales they all knew was disappearing, and the home nation was becoming just another part of England. This sparked many Welsh people to want to settle somewhere else in the world, and create something of a new Welsh settlement where traditional Welsh life and the language could live on. This sparked migration of Welsh people all across the New World. First off, many parts of the USA were actually set up as Welsh communities. Towns like Utica in New York and Scranton in Pennsylvania were initially Welsh towns. However, these towns were not able to properly hold on to their Welsh identity as pressure grew on the people to adopt the English spoken there and to live the American way of life. To start a proper new Welsh safe haven away from influence of the outside world, somewhere a bit more further afield in the USA would have to be chosen. In 1861, Michael D. Jones from Ballar in North Wales held a meeting with other Welshmen about where they could settle a new Welsh land outside of the USA. Jones was a Welsh nationalist and a principal of the local school. One of the first contenders was Vancouver Island up in Canada, though for one reason or another that clearly wasn't agreed upon. They all decided to look even further afield in the US and Canada. Instead, they delved into the South American nation of Argentina. At this time, Argentina was still a fairly new nation. It had only declared independence in 1816, and its constitution was written in 1853. This fledgling nation was more than happy to have people migrate to their lands. Jones contacted the Argentine government over this period and inquired about them being able to settle there. The Argentine government not only allowed them to settle, but also promised that they could continue to use their own language and maintain the Welsh way of life in Patagonia. There was also another motive for Argentina allowing the Welsh in. The area of land that they were going to put the Welsh in was under dispute between Argentina and Chile. Argentina, allowing the Welsh residents there, firmly established this land as their own. Argentina also described Patagonia as a very pleasant part of the country, describing it to be very similar to the rural lands of Wales. In 1865, just 4 years after that initial meeting, over 150 Welsh people from all across the nation gathered in Liverpool to board a ship setting sail to their new home in Patagonia. The journey from Liverpool to Patagonia took no less than 8 weeks. I'm informed that this was relatively speedy at the time, and this is how long the journey took with good weather. While the journey was pleasant enough, it seems their arrival wasn't quite as enjoyable. The land the Argentine government had allowed them to live in wasn't quite the carbon copy of rural Wales they were told it was. Instead, what they found waiting for them was a barren scrubland with little water, food, or natural resources like trees to create shelter with. Those first few nights must have been quite a shock to those who had left civilized Wales behind. The Welsh ventured on, however, with some extra supplies sent to them and the native people helping them. They found their way to the actual site they were offered to inhabit. This land wasn't much better, though it did have a river. The settlers named this river Cymru and founded their first permanent settlement of Rawson in 1865, both of which were very Welsh names. This settlement struggled with flooding and poor harvests at first. However, things started to get better thanks to a settler by the name of Rachel Jenkins. She realized that they could possibly harness the river's constant flooding for their own use. She created a simple yet effective irrigation system for the land that managed the flooding and allowed the land to become fertile and allowed farming production to increase. After this, the Welsh in Patagonia were off to the races. More and more people started to settle there from not just Wales itself, but other Welsh settlements like the aforementioned Welsh parts of the USA. The Argentine government even granted the Welsh settlers the title of the land in 1875. Through the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, more Welsh people came over, as the nation of Wales and the UK as a whole sunk into a depression. In just a few decades, those initial 150 Welsh settlers had turned this desolated part of Patagonia into a fertile, thriving Welsh utopia. This amazing job they had done on reinventing this land, however, drew the attention of more than just the Welsh. Much to the dismay of those native Welsh settlers, the great job they had done became something of a detriment, as people from all around the world, not just Wales, flooded in to call this lovely part of Argentina their new home. By 1915, the population had grown to roughly 20,000, with only half of those thought to be Welsh and still speaking the language they held so dearly onto. Their language was a key reason as to why they settled in such a remote location in the first place. They wanted to protect it and not let it get intermixed with other languages. This huge influx of non-natives threatened that, however. It wasn't only this that threatened them, as in the early years of the 20th century, the Argentine government started to sour on that Welsh settlement. Why they soured, I'm not too sure. Perhaps they were annoyed at how many immigrants it was bringing in from around the world. By now, maybe Argentina has shaped its own image more and didn't want to have that Welsh influence over their own identity. The government stepped in here and ruled that Welsh could no longer be spoken in local governments or in schools. This started to bring Welsh Argentina into a bit of a decline. While it was unable to be spoken in those places, Welsh was still proudly spoken at home and at church, so the language did manage to survive in the land. Over 100 years have passed since the Argentine government put a ban on the language, and it seems like that ban isn't still in place. While Welsh is not as spoken there as when it was first settled, it still has a surprising presence in the land. Patagonian Welsh, as it has come to be known as, has between 1,000 to 5,000 native speakers, and 50,000 Argentines claim to have Welsh ancestry. The Welsh connection in Argentina is concentrated in the three main Welsh settlements of the country: Gammon, Trelu, and Trevelin, all three of these being Welsh names. It is in these places where you will find Welsh language signs and the previously mentioned Welsh tea rooms. From what I can see, it really does look incredibly Welsh. However, it does maintain a South American flair to it all. If you by any chance happen to be from here, please let us know down below what it's like in the comments. The region has very close ties to Wales too, with there being many exchange trips between the two places set up by universities and schools. Together, Wales and Welsh Argentina have been able to help revive the Welsh language in recent years. And while Welsh is spoken in both places, the Welsh spoken in Wales and the Welsh spoken in Argentina aren't exactly the same. As I mentioned, this variation of Welsh is known as Patagonian Welsh, and it differs from normal Welsh. This is due to the fact that other languages have shaped it, most noticeably Spanish, which is spoken across most of Argentina. The overall accent has been influenced by Spanish, with the plosives of Welsh not being as dramatic sounding in Patagonian Welsh. Likewise, Welsh's glottal sh sound is more mellowed in Patagonian Spanish too. I also read some key phrases have been changed across the Atlantic too, with Spanish words being added to the Welsh phrases. One example being the Patagonian Welsh phrase of Paswichman, meaning pass in, being used to welcome someone into your house. In native Welsh, dochlimen, meaning come in, is used instead. The Patagonian's version is directly influenced by Spanish, and their word pas, meaning pass. Some brand new Welsh words have been coined in Patagonian Welsh too, such as undrofshafa. This is a Welsh translation of the Spanish word balneario, which means beach or spa or somewhere to bathe in general. Seems like my hopes of not having to say any more Welsh words didn't pay off. Though anyway, despite the concerns some have had in recent years about the decline of the Welsh language, it seems that now the tongue is thriving once again, not just in Wales, but somehow all the way over in the depths of Argentina, thanks to Patagonian Welsh. Video games started life as a small niche interest hobby only enjoyed by a select few, with those select few being nerds of the 70s and 80s. Since their modern inception, however, things have truly changed in the landscape of video gaming. Video games are one of the largest entertainment industries on our planet, generating more revenue than the likes of movies and television at times. The single biggest media franchise isn't Star Wars or Marvel or anything that relates to movies like you might expect, but instead it's Pokemon, which has earned an estimated $100 billion over its lifetime. Gaming these days takes on many forms, whether that be AAA high-budget games, independently developed games that shake up the industry, competitive gaming that has become a sport unto itself, mobile gaming that allows more people than ever to play video games, or even just the classics still going strong to this day. With the huge deal that video games are these days, it's not particularly surprising that, like most subcultures, this subculture has created its own words, terminology, and language. Various words and terms have emerged from the realm of gaming. Some of these are completely new coinages, while others are words used in different classes, or just words given a new meaning altogether. Many of these words have come about from being used in video games themselves, though the ones I'm more interested in are the ones that have been coined by those who play video games. With the rise of multiplayer online gaming, people from all across the world have been playing with one another, and they're not only playing but talking too. This form of communication has brought about some incredibly interesting words and uses of language over the years. Depending on your knowledge of gaming, I'm either going to sound incredibly old trying to explain these terms to you, or you'll be fascinated to discover these words exist. I don't want to merely just highlight these words, however. I want to share with you all exactly what they mean, and most importantly, how they came about. One of these terms I've actually already mentioned, that being AAA. AAA is the title given to games that have a high budget and are expected to perform well for companies financially. Things like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto are incredibly popular AAA games. The three A's of AAA, however, don't stand for anything in particular, though let me know what you think they could stand for down in the comments. This name seems to derive more from the letter grading system used around the world. Typically, if something is considered A, it means that it's really good, like how very popular celebrities are considered A-list. Clearly, 3 A's highlight something of extreme quality. It seems, however, that quite often AAA games don't always live up to that title. When you delve deeper into the world of video games, you will see that there are a lot of acronyms. Gaming is littered with these things, so I'll just cover some of them here. A huge amount of them are actually genres of games, like RPG, meaning role-playing game. This also created MMORPG, meaning massively multiplayer online role-playing game. There are also things like RTS, meaning real-time strategy, and MOBA, meaning multiplayer online battle arena. Outside of genres, we have acronyms like HP, meaning health or hit points, XP/EXP, meaning experience points, PvE and PvP, meaning player versus environment and player versus player respectively, QTE, meaning QuickTime event, and NPC, meaning non-playable character. Players may also talk to one another in acronyms, saying things like GG, meaning good game. These would have started out being typed to one another, but have since become something people say to one another, whether in person or talking over a microphone. I just mentioned MMORPGs, and a term that derives from these kind of games is aggro. Aggro is used as an adjective to describe when an enemy is focusing an attack on just one player. This term, of course, comes from a simple shortening of aggravate/aggravation. While it gained popularity in gaming circles thanks to games like World of Warcraft, it's pretty likely people are already shortening turning aggravate into aggro before gaming. Most noticeably, it has been used in British slang. Another term that became popular thanks to MMORPGs is grinding. Grinding means a lot of things. In fact, in some video games like Tony Hawk's and Sonic the Hedgehog, you're allowed to grind in a more literal sense. The type of grinding most gamers are referring to when using the term is the act of doing the same repetitive tasks and missions over and over for a greater reason. Whether that greater reason being to reach a higher level or to obtain something through random chance. The reason this act in gaming is called grinding is because of the dull, repetitive nature of it. As mentioned, outside of gaming, grinding means an awful lot of things. The way it links closest to game grinding, however, is in the world of food production. Many food products are ground, like oats to make flour in a mill. This grinding is often a boring, repetitive task, like in games. If you grind for long enough in a video game, however, you may receive some sort of buff. Buff in gaming terms simply means to make something strong. Buff can be used in a variety of ways in games. It could mean an item or weapon is made strong, a spell could be cast that makes something stronger, or it could mean that the developers of the game have updated it to make a character stronger. If something has been enhanced in some way, the word buff can be applied to it. It's believed buff in this sense originally derived from pen and paper role-playing games, where there would be times where your strength could be increased temporarily. Buff of course existed way before this, however, as a term meaning strong, hence how it got applied to video game strength. It seems that buff as an adjective meaning strong and attractive derives from the original verb of to buff, meaning to polish up something or to make it look good. Unfortunately, however, games and their creators can take away just as much as they give. This can even be a good thing at times. Sometimes a character or weapon is too strong and can break the balance of the game. This is when the opposite of buffing comes into play. The opposite of a buff is sometimes simply called a debuff. However, there is another word of interest, that being nerfed. When something is nerfed, it is seen as being made weaker, usually by the developers as opposed to an in-game effect. One game in particular is seen as bringing the term nerf into popularity, that being Ultima Online. When it was first released in 1997, it was wildly unbalanced. Most noticeably, the swords were way more powerful than other weapons, meaning using other weapons like bows or axes was pretty much pointless. In response to this, the developers weakened swords. The player base of the game were happy with this, of course, and they started to compare the swords to toy swords, specifically to the like of foam Nerf toys, who are more known for their guns but seem to make swords too. From here on out, the name of this toy company became a verb in the gaming world, meaning to make something weaker, because actual Nerf toys are like real weapons, but just weaker. It's a really clever use of language and one I enjoy immensely. It seems to have even started to leak out of the world of gaming, and is being applied to watered down versions of things in general. Moving away from the world of MMORPGs and into the world of online shooters, however, these games are immensely popular and have created language and terms too, with camping and its verb form of camp being a notorious example. Camping in the real world is a pretty fun activity, however in gaming camping isn't quite as enjoyed. Camping is when a player stays still in one tucked away spot and takes out players from that spot. It's a hotly debated tactic as many feel it takes away from the fun of the game. This term of course comes from real world camping, and the fact that tents are pitched up in one spot and the owner tends to simply stay put there. Maybe camping in games is meant to evoke that idea of being stuck to the ground, in the same way tents are literally pegged into the ground. Camping could be considered a form of cheesing, another great gaming term. Cheesing in the world of gaming is the name for an underhanded tactic / doing something in an easier, not intended by the developer's way, or just flat out cheating. It can also be a verb, e.g. I cheesed my way through that part of the game. How this dairy product got linked with gaming we don't seem to be too sure exactly. One source said it's a Korean corruption of the word cheat, while others say it's also because it sounds similar to cheating. Cheesy is a term outside of gaming meaning something is a bit rubbish and naff. It could quite possibly tie into these ideas of cheese too. Cheese isn't the only way in which food has inspired gaming lingo, however. Salty is an adjective that has existed for a very long time. Things like food or the ocean have been described as salty for quite some time. I guess salty has been used to describe people in the past too. Sailors have often been described as salty, I guess due to their ties to the ocean. However, gaming has led to many people being described as salty. Gamers are called salty when they are upset or bitter about something in their game. game, most likely because they were losing an awful lot. It's easy to understand why this seasoning became an adjective to describe the irritated. Salt has something of a unique bitter taste to it, and people who are feeling salty because of games are often seen as being bitter and annoyed. Salty is a wonderfully sensory word, and this is almost Shakespearean, as he would often use established words in new ways like this. At least I think so anyway. A certain kind of video game player may make you feel salty, however. Gamers who cause havoc just to be a pain. These people are known as griefers, with their act of annoying people known as griefing. This is a different word from grieving, the traditional verb form of grief. This term comes from the fact that to cause someone grief means to annoy them immensely, and that's exactly what griefers do and get a kick out of it. A lot of these aforementioned terms are used in the modern world of gaming. However, gaming has been around for a good few decades by now, so let's start stepping back in time. These next few, while still in use today, hit the mainstream in the 2000s. An example, the word of noob. This is used to describe / taunt someone who is new to a video game. Noob obviously comes from the term of newbie, a name used to describe someone new to something, usually a profession. Newbie was shortened to noob, and from there it evolved even more. You'll often find people spelling noob with zeros instead of O's thanks to LeetSpeak, something that could have a whole video unto itself. Noob has also been seen spelt more phonetically, becoming noob too. The gaming term of owned came into popularity around the same time as noob. To own someone in gaming terms means to easily defeat them. Owned also seems to have given us pwned too, which means the same thing more or less. This seems to just be a corruption of owned once again mixed in with LeetSpeak, which as I said is something that needs its own video. However, pwned may also be inspired by the pawn in chess too, something else from the world of games that are easily defeated. However, as we step even further back in time, we arrive in the world of arcade games. These retro games created language unto themselves. One I like is boards. Boards were the name given to early levels of video games. Think of the likes of the Pac-Man maze and the various courses of Donkey Kong. These were called boards as they were static and didn't move around the screen like side-scrollers would in the future. They were called boards as they were reminiscent of the boards of board games. I love this term as it shows us how in these early days of video games, people would use names based on real-world things to help understand this new way of gaming. Games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong could be played long enough, however, that the game would simply give up on itself. These glitched ends are known as kill screens, as it's on this screen of the game in which your character was forced to be killed. Finally, let's end things on one of gaming's most well-known terms. 1-up. A 1-up is a casual term for an extra game life, meaning you can carry on if you were to die. This term actually comes from the world of pinball, in which signs on some tables will pop up saying either 1-up or 2-up. These were signs to signify whose turn it was, either the first player's or second. 1-up in the world of pinball was a very truncated way of saying player 1, you're up. It seems that this term was then introduced into the world of video games as the name for extra lives. I'm sure many in the early days of 1-ups and boards felt that video games would be a mere fad. However, as the years rolled on, the world of gaming only got bigger and bigger. As it grew, more language evolved in the culture until we have this wonderful lexicon we have today for the world of video games. But as video games grow, so do the words we use in and around them. Who knows what weird and wonderful words and meanings the world of video games will give us next. Suriname might possibly be my favourite country name, and that's for one simple reason. Completely within the name of Suriname is the word of name unto itself, and you know how much I love names. Though, has the etymology of Suriname actually got anything to do with the noun of names, or is it just a big coincidence? Well, this name seems to be actually of native origins, believed to come from a tribe of people who once lived in this land, those being called the Suriname. However, we seem to know very little about these guys, as even by the 16th century, when European migration was starting to take place, the Suriname had been disbanded, so where their name came from we don't seem to be too sure. What we seem to be sure about, however, is that this tribe's name got attached to the Suriname River, which was what the country was then named after. So it's a nation named after a river named after a tribe. However, this doesn't really explain the name part of the name now, does it? The tribe were called the Suriname, so how how did that become Suriname? Well, the suffix seems to actually be somewhat common in the nation. In example, there's also a river called the Coppenham River. It seems to come from one of Suriname's native tongues and means river mouth. So the fact that the tribe's name ended with an N and the fact that they had this established suffix in their language already meant that they could put together these two words to create the word name in English, despite the fact it has nothing to do with names. This means that this name, featuring the word name, is little more than a coincidence, but a fun one nonetheless. Suriname is more than just a fun sounding name, however. The nation lies in the north of South America, and despite being on the continent, it is seen by many as a Caribbean nation, having many ties with the island nations in that sea. It is also the smallest nation on the continent in terms of geographic size and population. It is just over 163,000 square kilometers in size and has a population of just over 540,000. Yes, I do know that the French Guiana does have a smaller population, but that's an overseas part of France and not its own nation, so shush. Do not be deceived, however, by this small landmass and population, as despite these tiny stats, the nation of Suriname has masses of something else entirely: languages. Suriname is a goldmine for language lovers like myself and yourself. In a continent dominated by Spanish and Portuguese, this tiny slice of South America bucks the trend entirely. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that while we are focusing on Suriname here, there are a huge variety of languages spoken all across South America. It's far more than just Spanish and Portuguese as you may think at first. Back to Suriname, however, and what I also find fascinating about this nation's languages is the huge variety of ways in which these languages arrived in the country. Many of these languages are native to the land and have been there for thousands of years, while many have been brought over to the nation via immigration and colonization, including the nation's surprising official language. And there's even languages that have formed in relatively more recent years, thanks to other languages intermixing with one another. As I mentioned, this part of the world is an incredible place for language variety. Wikipedia lists 23 different languages being spoken in this tiny area. While a few of them are the usual suspects, some listed here really took me off guard. I'm in no way surprised to see the likes of Spanish, Portuguese, French and English are spoken here. But Javanese? How did a language from the other side of the Pacific Ocean end up here? Today I just want to highlight these languages, find out what exactly they are, and how they arrived in the land. The first languages here were of course the many native tongues of the area. The land that makes up modern Suriname has been inhabited since 3000 BC, way before Europeans ever touched these shores. It's unsurprising that in this huge amount of time a variety of languages emerged. In 3000 BC, unsurprisingly, they didn't care too much for borders like we do. This means that many of these languages are not only spoken in Suriname, but in the neighbouring nations too. And there's a huge difference in amounts of speakers for many of these tongues. Some are spoken by thousands, while others just a handful. Take the language of Akario in example. This is a language spoken by a small hunter-gatherer tribal people with the same name that reside within the nation of Suriname. One estimate says there are just 40 speakers of the language left to this day. This is an incredibly endangered language within the nation. The language of Arawak, also known as Lokono, isn't as diminished thankfully, though still only has roughly 2,000 or so native speakers. The speakers of this language not only reside in Suriname, but other places on South America's northern coast like Guyana, French Guiana and Venezuela too. It's this language where the previously mentioned am suffix meaning river mouth comes from, meaning these guys are the ones to blame as to why Suriname has the word name in its name. This is a language that was also once spoken natively on some of the islands of the Caribbean Sea, tying Suriname to the Caribbean Sea even more so. Likewise, there's also the Carib language of the Carib/Kalina people. This is a language spoken across these same countries too, and even down into Brazil as well. If you didn't happen to realise, it's this language and its native speakers as to what the Caribbean Sea is named after. There's thought to be between 7,000 to 10,000 speakers of this tongue, so once again more than previous languages, but still not too many. The Sikiana language, however, is not as fortunate. Wikipedia claims that in a 2001 count, there were just 33 speakers of the language in Brazil and 15 in Suriname. This is another extremely endangered tongue. Territorial likewise is spoken between just Suriname and Brazil too, by just around 1,000 speakers. The Waiwai language is spoken primarily in Brazil with a few hundred or so in Suriname and Guyana. The most widely spoken of these indigenous languages, however, is Uralic, spoken by roughly 20,000 across Suriname, Guyana and Venezuela. What's also interesting about this one is it doesn't seem to be related to any of the other Native American languages. languages. Guyana, however, has just around 800 speakers across South America. If you weren't keeping track of all those, that's 8 native languages spoken in Suriname alone. Though despite these aforementioned languages being present in the land for thousands of years, none of them are the nation's official language. So, what is? Well, this is a key example of Suriname breaking away from the conventions of the rest of South America. The majority of South America either has Spanish as its official language or Portuguese in Brazil primarily. Suriname, on the other hand, has Dutch. Yep, the language of all things tulips and clogs has found itself at home all the way across the Atlantic. All official business, media and education in the land is conversed in Dutch. Suriname is only one of 3 countries to have Dutch as its official language, the other 2 being the Netherlands itself and Belgium. This is of course a remnant of the Netherlands' former large world empire. In 1650, Suriname was actually under English rule. It was only 17 years after this, however, in 1667, that the Dutch seized this land from England and claimed it for themselves. Suriname would stay under Dutch rule from 1667 all the way until 1975, when it was finally made independent from the Netherlands. This was more than enough time for the Dutch language to become entrenched in the land as its official language. Surinamese Dutch has even gone on to become its own kind of thing. It's not incredibly different to the Dutch spoken in Europe, however. From what I can gather, a Dutch speaker from Suriname and a Dutch speaker from the Netherlands could understand each other pretty easily. There are other exported tongues in the nation, but we'll cover those in a moment. Right now, however, I want to focus on the many Creole languages that have come into being in the nation. Creole languages are languages that primarily developed across the Americas in the 17th and 18th century. They came into being out of necessity, when people from various backgrounds were put together and didn't speak the same language. Perhaps the best example of a Creole is the French-inspired Creole of Haiti, which has gone on to become one of the nation's official languages. There are a few Creoles that have emerged from Suriname, the most widely spoken of these, however, being Slanan Tongo, known as just Slanan for short. This is an English-based Creole, which is also influenced by the likes of Dutch, Portuguese and some other West African tongues. Despite Dutch being the nation's official language, Slanan is spoken way more widely and is considered the nation's lingua franca. Apparently, roughly 80% of the nation's population speak this tongue. From what I can gather, it seems to be the language of the people, while Dutch is still reserved for the elite. While Slanan has some respect, it's not taught in school and has no official status, despite being so widely spoken. If you happen to be watching from Suriname, I'd love to know what the relationship between Dutch and Slanan is like in reality, as all I can really do is gather facts from the internet and books. And for those interested in the name of this language, it simply means Surinamese tongue. While Slanan Tongo is the most popular Creole in the nation, it's not the only one. And what's interesting about these other Creoles is that they are also the languages of Maroon people. Maroon people are something I didn't know all too much about, however, but they are deeply fascinating. Maroons are descendants of African slaves in the Americas who fled and formed settlements away from the society of their slavers. Many of them actually went on to live with natives of the land, leading to populations of people of African descent living lives like natives of America. This happened all across the Americas, leading to Creole languages being created from the native languages and whatever tongues these escaped slaves spoke. The most commonly spoken of these in Suriname is the Nunjuka language, also called Ukan and Eastern Maroon. Just shy of 70,000 people speak this tongue across Suriname and French Guiana. The fellow Creole language of Quinti is closely related, but has far less speakers, just a few hundred or so. Then there's also the Creole Maroon language of Saramacan, with a whopping 90,000 speakers. This tongue seems to have a stronger African influence than others. The Matawai tribe of Suriname speak a variation of this language, however their numbers stand at just 70,000 or so. Finally, there's the language of the Palamacan people, who are another Maroon tribe living in Suriname. This language has a few thousand speakers too, and from what I've read, is pretty similar to the very popular Slanan. Despite this large variety of Creole languages, it seems that they are all somewhat mutually legible with one another. What probably hasn't been as legible, however, is my pronunciation of some of these language names. Unfortunately, it's pretty hard to find the correct pronunciation for some of these, so apologies once again on that front. Anyway, While that's all the Creoles, there are even more languages spoken here. That's with tongues that have been exported from other parts of the world. While Dutch is the largest example of this, there are a few others. Somehow a handful of Asian languages have made themselves at home here. One has even become something of its own language unto itself, that being Suriname Hindustani. This is an Indian language that was heavily inspired and changed by various other languages spoken in Suriname. Though, how did an Indo-Aryan language come into existence in South America? Well, this once again dates back to the time in which the Netherlands ruled this part of the world. It wasn't only South America they had land in, however, as they had land in India too. When the Dutch needed labour and workers in Suriname, they sent people from India to Suriname. It was these Indian workers who interacted with people in Suriname as the house Suriname Hindustani was born. Now there are thought to be around 150,000 speakers of the tongue. It wasn't only India the Dutch had land in, however. A very similar situation happened in Indonesia too, with the Dutch taking people from their land in Indonesia to work in Suriname. This is how Javanese ended up in the land too, with there being around 100,000 people of Javanese descent in Suriname to this day. Chinese has also found its way into Suriname too, with Chinese migrants coming over to the land in the 19th century. And of course we have the aforementioned usual suspects of Spanish, Portuguese, French and English being spoken in the country too. Those first three are spoken here because they're the three main languages of South America, and English is spoken there too simply because English gets pretty much everywhere, though there are old English ties in the land too. Whether it be languages spoken in the land for thousands of years, migrant tongues that have made themselves at home, or even brand new Creoles being created out of necessity and becoming widely spoken, Suriname seems to have it all and really is a linguistic treasure trove. Let's bring this all back however to where this video begun, with the name of Suriname. What is this nation even called in all these languages? Well, luckily it seems that all these languages use a name somewhat similar to Suriname, which makes things much easier. When you think of the United Kingdom and the languages of my homeland, one language in particular comes to mind, that of course being English. That makes all the sense in the world, in all honesty. English is by far the most widely spoken language of the United Kingdom and across the entire globe even. The English language is this nation's biggest export. While it is by and large the most popular language of the United Kingdom, it's definitely not the only language of the UK. To call it the nation's sole language would be a huge disservice. So what other languages are spoken in the United Kingdom exactly? Well, let's start with some of the more obvious ones. I'm sure you know, but the UK is a country made up of countries, those being England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. These three other countries have languages too: Irish, Welsh and Scottish Gaelic. There's also the language of Scots, but that could be a video unto itself. There's also the likes of Cornish from the county of Cornwall, and there's also the languages of the Crown dependencies, which are independent nations that have ties to the UK. Manx spoken on the Isle of Man is a great example. These Celtic languages play a key role in the identity of the United Kingdom, and while most of them are a minority with English being more dominant, it's still worth recognising them as languages of the United Kingdom. While these languages are heavily linked with the UK, these aren't the only languages spoken in the United Kingdom. There are some far more exotic, unique and unheard of languages being spoken under the watch of the Crown. Of course there are migrants who live in the UK who speak languages like Chinese, Bengali and Polish for an example, but I'm not really talking about those today. I want to talk about some languages that are completely native to where they are spoken, but are still considered parts of the UK. I'm of course talking about the languages of the British Overseas Territories. The British Overseas Territories are rather unique things. Explained in the most simplest of ways, they are remnants of the former powerhouse that was the British Empire. While this empire's land has decreased over the year, tiny fragments of it remain. Those fragments are the British Overseas Territories. They range from small islands to large pieces of land, and they are found all across the globe, from the Caribbean Sea, the Indian Ocean, and even in Antarctica. There are 14 of these territories, and in alphabetical order, they are Anguilla, Bermuda, the British Antarctic Territory, the British Indian Ocean Territory, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Montserrat, the Pitcairn Islands, St Helena, Ascension and Tristan da Cunha, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, the sovereign base areas of Akrati and Dhekelia, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. I know I said that there were just 14 of these and that was way more than 14 names, but many of these islands are joined together as single entities with multiple notable names. All of these places are technically part of the United Kingdom, however they do have varying degrees of self-governance. They have their own leaders, flags and currencies unique to those used in the main UK area, and of course these places have histories and cultures that stretch out way beyond their rule under Britain. They were not just empty landmasses the UK claimed. This means that languages were being spoken in some of these areas way before the British blundered their way in and drenched them in English. On top of this, however, completely new languages and dialects have come into being because of the rule of the United Kingdom have had over these lands. This gives us some really interesting languages that we don't traditionally link as being from the UK, but are technically spoken in the nation. This means there's a huge variety of languages in this nation if we include those spoken in these overseas territories. And it's way more than just the English many of us link with the United Kingdom. However, even in these overseas territories, English still maintains a stronghold. English is the official language of most of these overseas territories, despite where they are geographically on our planet. A great example is with the overseas territory closest to the island of Great Britain, that being Gibraltar. This tiny area of land, most known for its rock, is attached to the Spanish mainland, and in the past it was part of Spain. It was captured by the British in 1704, and from there attempts have been made for it to come back under Spanish rule. While firmly a British overseas territory for now and not ruled by Spain, this hasn't stopped Spanish being spoken in the region. From what I've gathered online, most residents of Gibraltar are able to speak Spanish as well as the official lingo of English. However, another source pointed out that Spanish is actually starting to disappear in the area, with children picking up the language less and less. Even if this is the case, I find it incredible that there's a nook of British land in which Spanish is widely spoken. What's perhaps even more interesting about language in Gibraltar is that an entirely new dialect has emerged in the land. Llanito is a tongue entirely native to this small area of land at the southern tip of Spain. This language's name is also used as a colloquial term for Gibraltarians too. The name of this dialect means people of the flatlands / little flatlands, which is thought to reference some of the geography of the area. Llanito seems like an incredibly curious language / dialect. I'm not quite sure what category it falls into even after researching it. Most describe it as a mixture of British English as well as Andalusian Spanish. However, many other languages have influenced it too, like Portuguese and Maltese. This language came about from the huge mixture of cultures that have called this land home. And from what I can gather, hearing it spoken aloud sounds like a quirky mixture of Spanish and English. This means that certain words in the language are a mixture of the two. Take a word like saltapina, which means salted peanut. It sounds a lot like salted peanuts in English, but has a distinctly Spanish flair to it. Like Spanish in Gibraltar, however, there are concerns that this incredibly unique tongue could be on the verge of extinction too, thanks to young people adopting English over it. Hopefully it stays around, as it kind of gives the United Kingdom its very own Romance language in a weird way, a type of language I would never expect to be widely spoken in any area of the UK. From one end of the Mediterranean to the other, we have the island of Cyprus. This is an island with a variety of territorial claims. Two small areas of it, however, are actually British overseas territories, Akrotiri in the west and Delakelia in the east. Cyprus gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1960. However, it seems these two small areas were allowed to be held onto by the British. These two regions are primarily used for military reasons. They are outposts for the United Kingdom's intelligence service out in the Mediterranean, meaning they are pretty darn important. English is of course these areas' official languages. However, as they're part of Cyprus, it means that other tongues are pretty common there too, most noticeably Greek and Turkish, which are also the official languages of the Republic of Cyprus. Once again, Greek and Turkish were not languages that are expected to be widely spoken on technically UK soil. A large amount of the British overseas territories lie in the Caribbean. It's in this region as to where other rather unique languages, dialects and creoles make themselves at home on British soil. Take the Cayman Islands an example. While Columbus was the first European to record the island's existence, it was the United Kingdom that would eventually take control of them in 1670. However, a permanent settlement was not established on these islands until 1730. These were of course English-speaking settlements, and to this day, English is the official language on these islands. What's interesting, however, is that on these islands, English has changed more and become its own dialect. It's something I've seen referred to as Cayman Island English and Cayman Island Creole. From what I can gather, Cayman Island English is a variation of the English language with a strong Caribbean influence, primarily from the nation of Jamaica, in which the Cayman Islands are relatively close to. While this variation hasn't been widely studied, in more recent years it has gained a more dedicated following, so much so that in 2012, native Cayman Islander Kevin Gorin put together the first ever Cayman Island dictionary, which compiled many words and phrases originating from this variation of English. Now, if only I could get my hands on a copy. Other English Creoles inhabit the Caribbean as well. Take Bermudian English spoken in the British Overseas Territory of Bermuda. While Bermuda is a part of the UK, its geographic ties to the United States have actually shaped this variation of English more so. Bermudian English is seen as a form of American English as opposed to British English, with it supposedly sounding similar to accents from southern USA like Virginia and South Carolina. It's pretty remarkable to hear that UK soil is home to a variation of American English. I'm spitting out my tea just thinking about it really. Turks and Caicos Islands have their own native Creole too, which is spoken in this British Overseas Territory. Like the Creole of Bermuda, it seems to have been influenced heavily by Caribbean English as a whole, but has its own unique spin on things. Also, to actually do some name explaining in this video, the Turk Islands have a very unique etymology. They're named after a type of cactus that grows on these islands. These cacti are known as Turk's head cacti. This is because they have a part on the top of them that looks reminiscent to the popular Turkish hat, the fez, leading to the rest of the plant being seen as the head of the Turkmen wearing this Turkish hat. So the plant was named after a type of hat, and this plant went on to be the namesake for these islands, as this cacti grew so prosperously here. It's not the universally agreed upon etymology, but it's the one I enjoy the most. The Caicos name is believed to come from a native language, however, and simply means a string of islands, as that's what they are. An accurate name, that's for sure, but not as unique as being named after a hat. Away from the Caribbean Sea and in the South Atlantic Ocean, we have the Falkland Islands. These islands were claimed by the UK in 1765, and while disputes have broken out over them, they've maintained British rule, though they do, like most British overseas territories, have a degree of self-governance. Before the British got there, they were completely uninhabited, meaning there really isn't a native language here. However, the English spoken by settlers here has spun off into its own thing. Falkland Islands English is seen as another unique dialect of English. From what I can gather, however, is that despite being so far from the UK, the accent sounds a lot like traditional British ones, without too much influence from the Spanish of South America as one may expect. What is much more unique, however, is the Pitcairn language spoken in the British Overseas Territory of the Pitcairn Islands. This is another Creole that is a mixture of 18th century English as well as Tahitian, a Polynesian language. This is because the Pitcairn Islands are in the Pacific Ocean. This really is an incredibly unique language. Not only does it have that Polynesian connection, but the fact it derives from 18th century English means that it's kept terms from the language of that time that aren't used in modern English. One source points out that many nautical terms are used in this language, which are now rather outdated, as this territory was settled in a time of great seafaring. What's also great about Pitcairn is that it actually has official status on the islands, unlike languages such as Yanito. This means that the United Kingdom has a Polynesian-inspired language as an official tongue. Well, sort of. These British overseas territories give us a much wider breadth of languages and dialects that we really don't stereotypically expect to be spoken on British soil. But here they are, from Romance languages to Polynesian languages to Creoles inspired by the Caribbean world. The British overseas territories are a reminder that the languages of the United Kingdom are way more than just English. Like living beings. Like us, they are born. However, by being born, it means they also have the ability to die. While some languages have been spoken in one form or another for thousands of years, others have not been too lucky. Over the span of human history, we have lost so many languages. Mighty tongues like Latin spoken by the dominant Roman Empire have ceased to be used, and one can only begin to imagine how many native tongues of the Americas have been lost over the years. We aptly call these languages dead languages. Side note, a dead language is any language that does not have a native speaking community, hence why Latin is considered a dead language, despite the fact it can still be learned and is spoken. When a language dies, it normally isn't the most spectacular of events. It tends to be just the last few elders of a bygone time slowly passing away, taking the language with them. A notable example is with the Ayapenacu language of Mexico, in which the last two native speakers of the language didn't want to talk to each other. Supposedly they just never got along. However, there's conflicting reports as to whether this was actually the case or not. It's a fun story that's worth sharing nevertheless. Regardless, most languages go out with a whimper. One language in particular, however, went out with a bang, quite literally. This is because its last native speaker died in a literal explosion. Talk about a dramatic end for a language. This combustible language was the language of Dalmatian. You may have heard of Dalmatia. It isn't its own nation but rather a region in the modern nation of Croatia. It is located across the southern tip of the nation and along Croatia's west coast / the east coast of the Adriatic Sea. It's a part of Europe with a very rich history and has changed hands many times, being its own kingdom at one point in the larger Austrian Empire. Though perhaps Dalmatia's biggest legacy in the modern world is a certain breed of dog from this land which shares its name. Dalmatia is more than just a land area, however, as once upon a time they had their own language too, the aforementioned Dalmatian. While modern Croatia is considered a Slavic country and their language of Croatian being Slavic too, Dalmatian was actually a Romance language. It's believed to have come from the Vulgar Latin spoken by the old inhabitants of the Balkans, the Illyrians. This means that it was not only shaped by the original Latin, but it's been influenced by other languages too, such as Italian, and perhaps more importantly, Venetian. More on that language in a bit. This means Dalmatian was a Romance language amongst a sea of Slavic speakers. This might seem odd at first, however I'm sure you know this isn't the lone Romance language of Southeast Europe. Fairly close by is the nation of Romania, another Romance-speaking nation. It was thought in the past that Dalmatian was something of a missing link language between Italian and Romanian. However, further studies have determined that Dalmatian actually links more closely to the Western Romance languages, like France and Spanish, as opposed to Romanian. Even before its death, Dalmatian was a kind of difficult language to pin down. It was spoken across all the cities of Dalmatia. However, everywhere it was spoken, a completely different dialect was used. On top of this, it was primarily an oral language, meaning very little of it was actually written down. Obviously, this array of dialects and the lack of written evidence didn't really help in its demise. What didn't help either was how small of a speaking population the language had. Even at its peak, there was just an estimated 50,000 speakers. That's enough to fill the Aloha Stadium in Honolulu, apparently. Impressive in one way, but for a language, it's not that many people. When it was widely spoken, the place in which it was spoken most was the city of King's Landing, Dubrovnik. In Dalmatian, this city had a completely different name, however, Ragusa, which is the same as the city's Italian name. As mentioned, everywhere the language was spoken, it had a different dialect, and this dialect was aptly named Ragusan Dalmatian. The earliest written record we have of Dalmatian comes from Dubrovnik in the 13th century, though it most likely was being spoken prior to this. As I mentioned, they didn't write too much of this language down. However, we also know that by the 16th century, Dalmatian was already dead in Dubrovnik. Across Dalmatia, the language was slowly dying and other tongues were used in its place. Eventually, Dalmatian was spoken in just one part of Croatia / Dalmatia, that being on the island of Kirk, or as it was called in Dalmatian, Vikla. This name relates to the island's Italian name too, being called Verglia in Italian. This once again was however a completely different dialect of the tongue, being called Veglia to Dalmatian. The language was able to survive here due to the island's ties to Venice and the Venetian language. When the Venetian Republic was a thing, this island was a part of it, meaning this Romance language could coexist with its fellow Romance language of Venetian. Venice's time as an independent republic came to an end, however, in 1797. No longer being part of a Romance-speaking nation, this meant that this tiny Romance language's days were numbered. As the years went by, the island of Kirk came under rule of a variety of different empires. Austrian rule began on the island after the fall of Venice, and for a spell it was under Napoleonic rule. This meant that the language of Dalmatian started to disappear, with inhabitants speaking other languages instead. As this language was spoken by such a small amount of people, and so little of it had been written down, it meant that it had barely been preserved. Dalmatian remained unpreserved all the way until 1897. It was in this year that someone had the bright idea to actually try and document this tongue before it disappeared forever. This was a great idea, however there was one issue. By 1897, there was only one native speaker of the language left alive. This lone native speaker was a man by the name of Torno Ordena. He was born in 1823 and held a few different jobs during his life. He worked as a marine postman and as a church caretaker. There doesn't seem to be any information as to whether he had a family of his own or not. I'm sure you can gather from all this that Torno Ordena was a pretty ordinary person who lived a pretty ordinary life. He would have remained an unknown. However, his position as the last Dalmatian speaker made him incredibly valuable. It was the Italian linguist Matteo Bartoli who sought out this man in 1897 to study and record the language he spoke. Though by 1897, however, Torno Ordena was not perhaps the best person to be the sole possessor of an almost extinct language. Dalmatian was not his first language, it was the first language of his parents. He learned to speak it by listening in on their conversations. He only really used it to speak to them, and by 1897 his folks had been dead for 20 years, meaning he had not really spoken it for about 20 years. Also, by this time he was 74 years old and had lost most of his teeth. I am by no means an expert on language, but I'm pretty sure teeth were important for speaking. Not only was he not the best subject to extract the language out of, Matteo Bartoli was not seen as the greatest linguist by any means. He was certainly capable and had a great understanding of language, specifically focusing on the geographic spread of languages. However, he was by no means an absolute expert. The highly influential Italian linguist Giacomo Devoto talked about Bartoli, saying that taste for phonemics, syntax, stylist, general grammar, and the description of a system in general remained foreign to him, which is perhaps a statement I relate a bit too much to. Nevertheless, these two were our best shot at preserving the Dalmatian language. A 70-something-year-old man with no teeth who hadn't spoken it properly in 20 years, and a linguist who was by no means at the top of his field. They should be the stars of a sitcom or something. Despite being something of a linguistic odd couple, they got to work. Bartoli spent a huge amount of time with Ordana and listened to him speak the language and share his stories, making sure to note down as many words and phrases in the language as he could. His final study on the language, Das Dalmatische, contained almost 3,000 words, phrases and stories from the language shared by Ordana. On top of this, Bartoli explained the language's phonology and grammar in the study too, well, as best he could. To this day, Bartoli's study is the only complete description of the Dalmatian language that we have, containing all known texts and information that we have on the language. However, the original Italian version of this study kind of got lost. Before it went missing though, Bartoli translated it into German, which is the most well-known version, hence why the study's title sounded so German when I mentioned it a moment ago. It was only in 2001 when the German version was retranslated back into Italian. Bartoli researched the Dalmatian language with Ordena in 1897, which is incredibly lucky as in the following year of 1898, the language's last active speaker, Torno Ordana, met his end. He was a pretty old man at this stage, but that doesn't mean he died in a peaceful way or in his sleep or anything like that. As mentioned, he went out with a bang. He was literally blown up. On the 10th of June 1898, Torno Ordana was caught in an explosion. What caused this explosion, however, seems to be a topic of dispute. Some sources claim it was an accident due to some roadworks, while other sources claim it was an old landmine going off. Perhaps it was a mixture of the two and some roadworks activated an old landmine. The book this video is heavily inspired by, Lingo by Gaston Doran, says landmine, so I'm more inclined to go with that. Whatever the case, this explosion certainly happened, and poor Torno Ordana was certainly in the wrong place at the wrong time, as this explosion took him out. This explosion not only killed him, but also the Dalmatian language he and only he spoke natively. The death of a language is always a sad thing, that's for sure, and explosions are terrible, destructive things. However, out of all the ways for a language to meet its demise, a huge explosion is a pretty badass way to go out, that's for sure. You have to wonder what the chances of the last speaker of a language being killed in an unexpected explosion are. Stranger things have happened in the world of language, but this is up there. We have an exact date for the death of the Dalmatian language, something we don't get all that often, the 10th of June 1898. Though, has the language remained dead since then? Well, it might sound crazy at first, but we can actually bring languages back from the dead with enough time, study and commitment. In example, the death of the last native Manx speaker on the Isle of Man is seen as happening in 1974. However, it has since been revived and is being talked by more and more, with the island even being home to a Manx-only school. Manx is by no means thriving, but it's not as dead as we thought it would have been in the 1970s. Is there any chance that Dalmatian has had the same kind of revival? Well, Not quite, but the work and study carried out by Matteo Bartoli has allowed the language to be spoken once again. There are reportedly 20 people across the globe who are fluent in Dalmatian to this day, with a few hundred more who have some understanding of the language. On top of this, however, we have the Istriot language, another Romance language spoken on the Istrian peninsula of Croatia. In 2017, this language was classified as part of the Dalmatian Romance subgroup, meaning Dalmatian has a relative that is still living to this day, although there are only thought to be around 400 or so native speakers of Istriot. If you happen to speak this language, or one of the 20 or so people that can speak Dalmatian fluently, then please do us all a huge favour and try to avoid stepping on any continent with a deep history of colonization. Across the entire continent, there are thought to be just 1 or 2 countries that have never been colonized in any capacity, those being Ethiopia and Liberia, though Liberia is debated as a bit of a unique case. While it wasn't ruled by foreign powers, it was formed by foreign powers. This is something we've talked about in a video unto itself. So many argue that's just one nation that has never been colonized, Ethiopia. That's just one of 54 countries on the entire continent. Of course, with colonization comes languages. There's nothing colonizers love doing more than rocking up to a new part of the world and spread their tongue. That sounded weirdly sexual, I didn't mean that to happen. Often to the point of eradicating languages being spoken there before, or at least marginalizing them to a great extent. So much of the geographical distribution of language is down to colonization. It's why English is spoken across the USA and Spanish in so much of South America. This is of course the case in Africa too. Many of the official languages used by various African nations aren't native to the land. Take Nigeria's official language of English, Afrikaans, which is an adaptation of Dutch spoken in South Africa, and of course all the Arabic speaking nations across the continent's north. So many foreign powers and their languages have laid claim to these lands. However, what's most amazing about all this is that despite how tightly some of these foreign languages have dug their claws into the land, many native languages have been fiercely resilient and not only survived but continue to thrive. While I mentioned South Africa's Afrikaans as an official language, the native languages of Zulu, Swazi and Koshka all have official status too. Yeah, I'm not trying to click, I'm afraid. Koshka, Oshka, Oshka. You get the idea. Africa's languages have been wonderfully resilient in the face of colonization, and this can be seen perfectly in the nation we'll be focusing on today. Togo. Togo is a nation on the southern shore of West Africa, nestled between Ghana and Benin. It's a relatively small nation too, at just over 55,000 kilometers square in size, and its population sits around the 8.6 million mark. What's most interesting for us today, however, is just how many foreign powers have laid claim to Togo. The land which makes up modern-day Togo has been influenced by no less than 4 foreign powers, each bringing their own language along with them. Yet, despite a quartet of foreign rulers, the native languages that originated from these lands are still widely spoken across it, though of course foreign languages are still present, some a tad more than others. The history of Togo and the languages that call this land their home are really interesting. However, before we look into that, we ought to explain this nation's name. This is name explain after all. I have to have some pretense of etymology, I suppose. Well, Togo is actually named after the village of Togodo, which from what I can gather now ironically lies within the borders of its neighbouring Benin. The meaning of this name has been translated to mean a variety of things, though all with a similar meaning. It has been translated as meaning city beyond the cliff, the place on the other side of the shore, and city beyond the river. So whatever its specific meaning is, the name clearly relates to how the settlement lay beyond some geographic feature. Togo is thought to have first started being settled all the way back in the 11th century. This would have been tribes from the surrounding areas of Africa calling this land their home. It was across the 15th and 17th century, however, when the first real noteworthy tribes started calling this land their home, that being the Awe people. The Awe are believed to have migrated from land in modern Nigeria to this part of Africa, and to this day, the Awe are the largest ethnic group in the nation of Togo. Their language shares the same name as them, being called Awe. This language is seen as being part of the larger Niger-Congo language family that includes so many of the languages from sub-Saharan Africa. The Are people and other various African tribes remained in this land undisturbed until around the 18th century. It was in this century that Europe and the slave trade came to their shore. The slave trade led to whole villages of native Africans being uprooted and sent to the New World. Many natives, however, escaped from a life in slavery. Many in southern Togo escaped to the mountains in the north of the nation. They did this as being within the mountains made it more difficult for them to be captured and subsequently sold into slavery. These natives who lived in Togo's northern mountains became the Cabre people. Subsequently, they created their own language too, named Kobia. Like Awe, this language is too part of the larger Niger-Congo language family. However, Kabia is part of the Gur branch as opposed to Awe, which is part of the Kwi branch. Together, however, Awe and Kobia are two of the most well-known native languages in the nation of Togo and are still the most popular to this day. Though, as I mentioned, these languages have had to be highly resilient, as since they came to prominence around the 15th to 17th century, 4 foreign powers have laid claim in this land, and in turn have spread or attempted to spread their languages here too. The first of these foreign powers might be one you were not expecting, that being the Danes. I was rather surprised to hear this myself. While I knew the Danish Empire was sizable, I had no idea it reached into any part of Africa. However, the Danish only had slight influence over the land of Togo. The land they really had a hold on was the Togo's west, the Danish Gold Coast as it was called at the time. Now of course this is the nation of Ghana. The Gold Coast as it was called has been occupied by a huge variety of nations, from the British to the Portuguese to the Swedish. This is because the land was so rich in valuable natural resources like gold of course, but also oil and gas. This huge variety of foreign powers across the Gold Coast would have affected our Togo too. The land of Togo, however, would come under formal European rule in 1884, however. This was during the height of the infamous Scramble for Africa, a time period in which many foreign powers fully realized just how valuable the land of the continent could be for them, as suddenly they were all vying for a piece of the pie. As the name suggests, this was a bit of a scramble for the land. In this scramble, Togo came under German rule. It was claimed by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and the other nations agreed with this. Under German rule, the country got the name of Togoland, which is of course pretty much the name we know it as today, but with land tacked onto the end of it. This German Togoland included the area which is modern day Togo, but also area that is now in eastern Ghana. Under German rule, Togo became a farming colony. Oil palms grew naturally in the land, and the Germans were able to grow foreign crops there too, like cotton and cocoa. It was also while the land was under German rule that roads and railways came to Togo too. Overall, it's easy to see the huge impact that Germany had on this land. German rule in the nation would however come to an end, and that was with the advent of the First World War. Early on during this war, France and Great Britain occupied this German land. This was of course because Germany and France/Britain were on opposite sides during this war, so any German land they could claim would lead to an advantage. Once under French and British occupation, Togo would never be German again. In 1922, the League of Nations issued that Britain should administer the western part of Togoland and France to rule the eastern part of Togoland. This meant that both British and French influence fell onto the nation too, though between these two, French had a much stronger influence. As mentioned, that German Togoland included area in its west that is now part of modern day Ghana, and as Britain got to rule over the west of German Togoland, it meant the land they ruled over was never actually a part of modern Togo. Eventually, however, in 1956, the western British Togoland got merged into the Gold Coast Territory, which was also under British rule at the time, eventually becoming the nation of Ghana. That leaves us with just the eastern part of the former German Togoland, now under French rule, fittingly becoming named French Togoland. This land stayed under French rule from 1922 all the way until 1960. It was in this year the land finally achieved independence, becoming the Togolese Republic, which is the full official name for Togo. This means that the Danish, Germans, British and French all had varying degrees of control over these lands. But what about their languages? Well, if you hadn't guessed by now, French has had the strongest influence on this country. French is the official language of the nation, as it is in many other countries in this part of the continent. This means that French is used for most official reasons and used in schools and in business. English seems to have a province in Togo too, though how much of a presence I found conflicting reports. about. Some sources say that English is hardly used at all, but others say English is taught in schools in the land and is used in financial situations, such as in banks. If you're watching from Togo, let me know what the situation is. I unfortunately can't just hop onto a plane and check for myself, annoyingly. As for German and Danish, well, they seem to have had very little impact on the land. Danish makes sense as they didn't actually have too much control in the region, but I was surprised to see German wasn't popular either here. It seems even while the land was under German rule, the German authorities struggled with getting the residents to speak the language. This is pretty different to say Namibia, which was once under German rule too. Here German can still be heard and is a recognised language of the land. Though, what about those two native languages I mentioned at the top of this video, Awe and Kabia? Well, here's the great thing. Despite all these foreign powers claiming the country for themselves, they've persisted. As mentioned, people in German Togoland didn't want to learn German and carried on speaking Awe. From German rule to French rule, they stuck around, though of course French was and still is the official language. In 1975, the resilience of these languages was recognised, and they were made national languages. Today, Awe can be heard mainly in the nation's south, while Kabia is heard in the land's mountainous north. They're used for more informal occasions amongst friends and families. On top of these two native languages being given national status, Togo is full of even more native languages too. Togo is believed to be home to around 40 different languages. Some of these, however, we know very little about. These languages include the likes of Tem, Gen, Aya, Moba, Nitshum, Lama, Nwandum, Luf, Quatramanchima, Biali, Adangobi, Wudu, Mublim, and Kusal. Of course, I have no idea if I pronounced any of those right, but the very fact they're still on our planet makes me very happy. I just find it so awesome to know that despite how much influence foreign powers have had over these lands, these native languages didn't go extinct, as we've unfortunately seen in other parts of the world when it comes to foreign powers claiming their homelands. Africa really is home to some of the world's most resilient languages, and just looking to the small nation of Togo shows us prime examples of that resilience, which is hugely important, with many believing that communication between people is by and large only 30 to 40% verbal, with the other 60 to 70% of communication being non-verbal, with body language and hand gestures. Body language can range from huge sweeping gestures like waving our hands around to show how excited we are, to much more subtle things like narrowing our eyes together to show suspicion of someone or something. Body language is an awful lot like spoken language in the fact that it varies greatly across the globe, with different gestures meaning different things in different parts of the world. For example, the gesture of curling your index finger to your palm to beckon someone over is very common in Europe and the Americas. However, this gesture is seen as offensive in parts of Asia like China and the Philippines. The country perhaps best known for its body language, however, has to be Italy. Italian hand gesture and body language has become world famous and even a meme at this point. Italian people have become renowned for being incredibly expressive with their bodies when they talk. There's this great video of two Italian men talking to one another. You can't hear what they're actually saying, but their body language is so expressive you can basically follow the conversation anyway. One of the first things that I started thinking about when I had this idea for this video is what actually dictates the use of this body language. Italian natives or the Italian language? Like, if you're from Italy and speak Italian as your first language, but also speak a second language like English or Mandarin, do you still use your body language when you're speaking your second language? And conversely, if you aren't Italian but speak Italian as a second language, do you use this body language when you speak Italian? And even if you are Italian, are you more likely to use this body language if you're in Italy or not? Is it like an accent that you are more likely to use and pick up on if you are surrounded by other people doing it too? Annoyingly, I couldn't hop on a plane to Italy and figure this one out for myself, so I would love to hear from you guys. As research, I watched an interview of the Italian Great British Bake Off winner Giuseppe, where he was speaking English on an English show, and his body language was minimal, so maybe I'm wrong. Italy's body language most likely stems from the long and grand history that's played out over the nation. Many feel that the hand gestures of Italy date back to the nation's most famous residents, the Romans. A more accurate name for these hand gestures are chironomia, and it was developed by not only the Romans but the Greeks before them too. A lot of Roman culture is of course borrowed from ancient Greece, and these gestures are no different. As to why they flourished in Rome,
Well, that seems to be debated. There's a couple of interesting theories on the Wikipedia page for Italian gesticulation, another fancy word for body language. One of these theories gives early capitalism the credit for pioneering these gestures. As markets began to pop up in ancient Rome, communication began to excel. This is because people had to talk more to barter and negotiate prices. This increased communication between people is thought to stimulate the use of hand gestures. This does make some sense. Markets can be loud, busy places, so hand gestures might make more sense to use over the hustle and bustle. Plus, traders could have been from other parts of the world, so verbal communication might have proved ineffective due to the trader and buyer speaking completely different languages. Another theory on the prominence of hand gesture and body language in Italy places the blame on the Renaissance period during the 15th to 16th century. The Renaissance was all about celebrating humanity and trying to take human thinking back to the time of antiquity, like the ancient Romans and Greeks, as opposed to the deeply religious thinking that so many people had gotten into by this point. It's thought that to try and get more people on board with this concept, people would speak much more dramatically to garner attention. This included the use of huge sweeping hand gestures to attract more people. Hand gestures helped deliver the message of the Renaissance to people who were still thinking in that medieval way. Of course, the birthplace of the Renaissance was Florence, which was and still is a large city. It seems that cities to this day still play a large role in the Italian hand gestures. Supposedly, Italian people from/in cities are more likely to use these hand gestures. This is thought to come from the idea that it's both literally and figuratively harder to be heard within cities, so people needed a bit more gravitas to their communication in places like Florence, Naples, and Rome. Of course, the answer could also lie in the languages spoken across the peninsula in the past. While Latin is seen as the language of the nation's past, a huge variety of languages have been spoken there before and especially after the Romans. When Western Rome fell, various tribes from across Europe settled in the land. They all spoke different languages, so communication was difficult. This meant that body language and hand gestures started to play a much larger role in communication, becoming something of a universal language for everyone on the peninsula to use, regardless of what language they spoke natively. The country was only unified into the shape it is today in 1861. Today, there are thought to be around 250 different hand gestures used in Italian body language. Suffice to say, we won't be covering them all here, but I'd love to share with you some of the most popular and unique of them. A huge thank you has to go to the YouTube channel Intrepid Italian with Michelle. Their video on Italian hand gestures helped out amazingly. Go watch that video and their other videos if you want to learn more Italian. I know I will. Perhaps the most famous of their hand gestures is the Che vuoi hand gesture. This translates into "what do you mean?" and is more commonly called in English the pinched fingers or finger purse or even the pine cone. This is when the fingers on the hand are pinched together and face upwards. This gesture means something along the lines of "what are you doing?" or "what do you want?" but usually in a jovial manner accompanied by a silly face, though it can be seen as more serious if you pull a more serious face while doing it. Of course, one of the most beloved foods in Italian cuisine is spaghetti, and the desire to go get some spaghetti has its own hand gesture too. This gesture is simply called the spaghetti gesture and involves pointing your index and middle finger downwards and twisting them, imitating a fork wrangling up some spaghetti. And once you've eaten your spaghetti, you might want to show how tasty it is. Well, thankfully you can. The yum gesture signalizes that what you just ate was tasty and is done by poking your index finger into your cheek and twisting it around. It's a really fun gesture, but from what I can gather, it's primarily used with kids. If it was the best spaghetti you ever had, however, you might want to tell the world it was perfect. And there's a hand gesture for that too. This is the perfetto gesture. This is when you gather your fingers to your mouth, kind of like with the pinecone gesture, or you can just use your thumb and index finger too, then release them towards yourself. This is used to say something is really good. It's pretty similar to the OK gesture used around the globe too. Another interesting gesture is the occhio/eye gesture. This one is so interesting because it actually has two meanings depending on your facial expression. This gesture involves pulling the skin just below your eye down with your index finger. If you do this with a serious face, it means watch out. However, if done with a silly face, it means things like clever or sly. The andiamo gesture, however, is a bit more clear. It means let's get out of here and is done by pointing your fingers downwards and moving them in a diagonal line. This doesn't doesn't appear to be a fun let's get out of here, but more a I'm not enjoying myself and need to leave kind of a let's get out of here. Italy even has hand gestures to signify when something changes drastically. This is physically called the riches to rags gesture and is done by placing your palm down flat, then turning your hand around so it's instead facing upwards. This, as mentioned, is used to signal when something has changed drastically. Apparently though, it's only really used to signify a change for the worst. You wouldn't seem to use this if someone were to win the lottery all of a sudden, an example. A lot of Italian hand gestures relate to old traditions and superstitions of Italy, it would seem, and none of these exemplify this better than the horn gesture. This gesture is done to protect yourself from bad omens and misfortune in general. It's done by pointing your little finger and index downwards with your other fingers tucked away. If this looks familiar at all, it's because it was this hand gesture that became popularized around the world thanks to heavy metal. Only the horns were pointing upwards in honor of the devil as opposed to scare him away. Heavy metal and Satan have had a long history together, to say the least. If you think someone is being silly, however, for being scared of the devil, you could use the paura gesture. This is done a lot like the pinecone gesture but with spreading your fingers outwards and is used to tease someone about being scared of something. Though if you're just getting fed up with someone teasing you, you could say enough with your hands. This is with the basta gesture, which simply means enough and can be used jokingly or seriously depending on the tone of your voice and your face. If someone is being naughty, however, you could do the om gesture. This is done by pointing your forefingers downwards, stretched out and moving your hand around. You would do this if you caught someone in the act of doing something they aren't supposed to be doing. If their behavior is annoying you, however, you could do the Margarada T gesture, which means look at that and is used to signify that someone has done something that annoys you. This is done by raising your arm at the elbow and then pointing your fingers outwards with your palm in the air. This is actually a pretty common arm gesture outside of Italy too, and we do it to signify confusion. Now, however, we can move on to the really rude stuff, the gestures that parallel rude words. Sorry if these upset anyone. A great one is with the chin flick. This is when we flick our fingers away from under our chin. This means I don't care or I'm not bothered. We use it to show discontent with something. Then we have the umbrella gesture, which is much more aggressive, however. It means go away in much vulgar language. It's done by raising one hand into a fist and then slapping your other hand into the crook of your arm. Fun fact, the sprite for the Sailor and Pokemon games actually made this pose, but it was changed outside of Japan. Anyway, we're diving a little bit too far down an obscene gesture rabbit hole here. I was going to talk about biting thumbs, but that's not actually an Italian thing it would seem, but an English thing. It was popular in Elizabethan England, and this is when Shakespeare was alive, so when he put it in his play set in Italy, it became very much linked with the land. Though anyway, I'm sure you can see now that Italy pretty much has a hand gesture for everything and anything. Whether you want to get away from someone, tease someone, or just tell someone you're hungry for some spaghetti, there's very little you can't say with your hands in Italy. Languages spoken across the globe are very much like families. Most languages have a parent language they derive from, as well as sibling languages they relate to, which came from the same parent. The best example of this has to be with the Romance languages, which have Latin as their parent, and their siblings include the likes of Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, to name a few. Like real-life siblings, language siblings share similarities with one another. It's why there are words that are similar across different languages, though of course they are not identical. While there are some similar words in, say, Spanish and Latin because they are both Romance languages, someone who speaks solely one language and solely another language are not going to understand one another. Something that isn't a Romance language, however, is the language I'm using right now, the one spoken more than any other language: English. English is a very unique language for a variety of reasons, from its origins to its spread across the globe. This makes it easy for us to see English as something of a lone wolf in the world of linguistics, but that isn't the case at all. English is far from an only child and has a wide extended family. But out of all these family members of the English language, which one is closest to my mother tongue? Well, first and foremost, English is, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, a Germanic language. This alone should give you a clear indication as to what language might possibly be the most similar to English, but hear me out. While Germanic, English has been influenced by a multitude of other languages and has gone on to influence many other languages too. This means that languages that are close to English might not necessarily be part of the Germanic language family. For example, the French language is seen as being somewhat similar to English. It definitely isn't the closest relative to English, but with the Norman invasion of 1066, it meant that a multitude of French words or words with origins in French have found their way into the English language, and perhaps most noticeably into language's spelling in the written form. If we were to go along with the family analogy, French wouldn't be a direct relative, but maybe say a step-parent who came into English's life at a young age and had a degree of influence over them. Conversely, English has a deep influences on other languages outside of the Germanic family too. One I'm always tickled by are the words in Japanese which borrow from English. Japanese has borrowed words from all kinds of languages, with English being perhaps the most prominent, such as the Japanese word for ice cream being aisukurimu, which sounds remarkably like the English word. I just find it fascinating that a language like Japanese, that is so far removed from English in a variety of ways, still has an influence on it. By no means am I saying Japanese is the closest language to English either, but there are similarities there. Maybe in human family terms, English is a cool family friend that a baby Japanese wanted to imitate somewhat. And for the record, these human analogies I'm going to be using for this video are entirely made up by me for silly reasons and not based on any actual research. But yeah, English is a Germanic language, so its closest relative will most likely be another Germanic language. The earliest Germanic language we have dubbed Proto-Germanic and is something of a constructed language. This to English would be like a great-great-great-grandparent or something. Eventually, however, the Germanic language split into three groups, those being North, West and East Germanic. While all Germanic languages do have similarities, the ones in the same smaller groups would be more similar to one another, e.g. the North Germanic languages are all more similar to one another than the languages in the Western and Eastern Germanic branches. Things break down even more, however, as North Germanic breaks down once again into two smaller groups, those being West Scandinavian and East Scandinavian, all deriving from the Old Norse language. The West Scandinavian languages are Icelandic, Faroese and Norwegian, and the East Scandinavian languages are Danish and Swedish. None of these are English, as I'm sure you noticed, yet they have had influence on the language and are somewhat close to them, with also being Germanic languages. If you look at various North Germanic words, you will see similarities to English words. The North Germanic language with the closest similarity to English, however, seems to be Norwegian. This is because Norwegian, like French, had influence over Britain and the English language due to Viking invasions that took place over the 8th to 11th century. In human family relationship terms, well, say if your grandparent had a sibling and then that sibling went on to have children and then grandchildren. Norwegian is that in comparison to English, the grandchildren of siblings. Whatever the correct term for that is, someone go let me know down below please. Something worth mentioning before we carry on is that while there is the East Germanic subfamily of languages within Germanic, there is a slight issue with all that. That being that all East Germanic languages are now extinct. This included the likes of Gothic, Vandalic and Burgundian to mention a few. None of these have much / any influence or relationship to English. See them as English's long dead distant relatives. They didn't leave much of an inheritance. So we have established that English is neither a North or East Germanic language, which means that it has to be a West Germanic one. However, like North Germanic, West Germanic splits into a variety of smaller families too, and in some cases they break down into even smaller families too. One way Western Germanic languages split is into the two subfamilies of High German and Low German. This High and Low relates to the highlands and lowlands in different parts of the nation of Germany. Nothing to do with the pitch at which you speak these languages or anything like that. High Germanic languages include the likes of Yiddish and the modern German language, which all of these families are named after. Of all the languages that are part of High German, modern German is without a doubt one of the closest to English. Looking at German words, you can see similarities to them and English terms. See German as maybe a grandparent, sibling's child compared to English, which I think is a cousin once removed. Happy to be wrong on that one though. English finds itself within the Low German part of this subfamily, but Low German breaks down even further into Low Franconian, Old Saxon, and Anglo-Frisian. Unsurprisingly, Anglo-Frisian contains the English language. However, I want to look at these three Low German sibling family groups. Old Saxon contains just the extinct language of Low Saxon, so we needn't worry too much about it. Old Low Franconian, however, contains Flemish and Dutch. These two languages are pretty close to English, with Dutch perhaps being even more so. Dutch is seen as one of the easiest languages for English natives to learn, and vice versa. Seriously, most Dutch people speak better English than me. Dutch and Flemish to a lesser extent could be seen as the cousins of English, with their parent branches of Anglo-Frisian and Old Low Franconian being siblings. It's also worth mentioning Afrikaans too, a language spoken in South Africa which developed from Dutch and was influenced by native languages found in South Africa. Afrikaans is like a cousin to English too, but one that moved away and picked up on their new home's words and languages. So let's finally delve into the Anglo-Frisian branch, shall we? The Anglo in its name of course relates to English, though what about the Frisian? Well, that relates to the second language in this group, Frisian. You may not have heard of this language before. It is relatively small, with less than 500,000 native speakers, and only spoken in small parts of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. But linguistically, it is the actual sibling of English, and even looking at words in the language, you can see just how similar they are. It's fascinating that the most widely spoken language on the entire planet has a sibling that is so similar to itself, yet flies so greatly under the radar. It's a real Beyonce and Solange situation we have going on here. Many sources fittingly see Frisian as the language that is closest to English, but there is another which might be even closer. The issue with this one, however, is the fact that many argue that it's not a unique language, but rather is a dialect of English. That being Scots. Scots is unsurprisingly a language, and yes, I do see it as a language, spoken in Scotland. It derives from Old English, which gave us modern English too. Scots is incredibly similar to English. Most English natives will be able to read a sentence in Scots after a moment or two of deciphering. Its written form is somewhat akin to writing out phonetically a transcript of someone speaking English with a thick Scottish accent. Seriously, Scots is so close to English that if English and Frisian are siblings, then English and Scots are twins. It's just a shame that not everyone is in agreement with Scots being a language and instead see it as a dialect. But speaking of dialects, if we were to look into them two as more distinct things, then we could argue that the languages closest to English are the various dialect forms of English that have sprouted up across the globe, with things like American English, Australian English, Irish English, and even more local ones in England itself, like Scouse or West Country English. These could be seen as the children of English, but they aren't really seen as fully developed languages, so maybe see them as the still gestating in the womb children of English. Whether they will become fully independent languages, however, remains to be seen, and you know what? That analogy is getting really dark right now, so I'm gonna drop it there. So what is the closest language to English? Well, it's Scots. However, if you don't see Scots as a proper language, then maybe it's Frisian. But if you want something more popular, it's Dutch. And if you want something more popular than that, it's German, and so on and so on. Languages are so interconnected with one another and influenced by each other that even as mentioned, a language like Japanese, which is so linguistically and geographically far removed from English, can still have similarities with one another. While England might be on an island unto itself, the language of English is far from an island. Its siblings and cousins, parents and grandparents are distant and close, big and small, and some aren't even really related by blood. Yet it must be remembered that families really do come in all shapes and sizes, and it was this family that helped shape English into the language that it is today. Scotland, one of the four smaller nations that make up the larger nation of the United Kingdom, along with Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. Though I'm sure you already all knew that, right? While these four nations make up one country, they all have their own unique identity and features, with something that differentiates these nations within the UK being the languages spoken in them. Scotland has a rich history with languages. Scotland currently has 3 official spoken languages, as well as British Sign Language. The most popular of these is of course English. You've probably heard of this language. English, despite being named after the nation directly below Scotland, is seen as something of a native tongue in Scotland, and is seen as becoming the standard language in Scotland with the 1707 Act of Union, which kind of kicked off the creation of the United Kingdom. Before the Act of Union, however, and even further back, while English was forming down south, there was another language being spoken here, that being the Scottish Gaelic language. This is a Celtic language spoken in Scotland for over 1,000 years. It would have initially come to Scotland via people from Ireland travelling with their own Irish Gaelic language. This means that Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are very similar to one another, as well as Manx, which is also related to these languages. And if English and Scottish Gaelic weren't enough for this land, there's also a third officially recognised language in Scotland, though its recognition as a language has been debated throughout its history. This is the language simply known as Scots. Obviously, the reason this language has this name is because it's spoken in Scotland, and according to Wikipedia, it was shortened from Scottis into just Scots. Scots is actually a Western Germanic language. Other modern Western Germanic languages include the likes of German, Dutch, Frisian, and of course, English. In fact, Scots has an awful lot in common with our good friend of English. Both languages of modern day English and modern day Scots both come from the same ancestor language, that being Old English, with Scots being heavily influenced by the Old Northumbrian dialect of English, spoken in the northeast of England. It is in the early 15th century that Old English is seen as splitting into the two languages of Middle English, which would go on to become Modern English in England, and the language of early Scots in Scotland, which would go on to become Modern Scots in Scotland too. So Modern English and Modern Scots both come from the language of Old English. This shouldn't make it too surprising to hear that the languages of Scots and English are kind of similar. Take a look at this piece of writing written in Scots. If you are able to speak English, there is a good chance you're able to read this to some degree. Scots in its written form could be seen by some as someone writing in English phonetically with a thick Scottish accent. This is not the case, however. This is a completely different language, though it cannot be denied that it is strikingly similar to English. This is a fact we even highlighted in our older video of which language is closest to English, so slight spoiler for that one. Its similarity to English has been a sticking point for years. Many feel that Scots isn't actually a language unto itself, but is instead a dialect of English, in the same way that Cockney or Scouse English aren't seen as languages, but just seen as dialects of English instead. Some could even be more cynical and say that Scots isn't even a dialect, just someone speaking English with a thick Scottish accent. To understand this, we need a better understanding of what exactly is the difference between a language and a dialect. And for this, we will ignore accents for the time being. Accents more relate to the way voices sound as opposed to what those voices are actually saying. So in example, you could speak Scots with, say, a West Country accent. Anyway, that's a huge tangent. The OED defines a language as the system of spoken or written communication used by a particular country, people, community, etc., typically consisting of words used with a regular grammatical and syntactic structure, while it defines a dialect as a form or variety of a language which is peculiar to a specific region, especially one which differs from the standard or literary form of the language in respect of vocabulary, pronunciation, idiom, etc. These definitions highlight to us that a dialect is kind of a smaller, more specific form of a larger language, but still heavily relies on its parent language. While the consensus is that dialects come from languages, the argument could be made that dialects come together to form a standard form of a language. As linguist Max Reinreich put it, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So while that helps us understand what the difference between a language and a dialect is, when does a dialect become a language, if that's even possible at all? Well, that doesn't seem as well defined. There's no official regulation in place that defines when a dialect officially crosses over into a language. It's a very ambiguous thing. My favourite explanation of understanding if someone is speaking a dialect or a language comes from David Crystal's A Little Book of Language. In this book, he gives us the scenario of 4 people in a room. They're from Liverpool, London, Paris, and Bordeaux respectively. None of these people can speak any other language minus the ones from their native countries. So So who will be able to understand each other? Well, the answer is, of course, that the people from London and Liverpool will be able to understand one another, as will the people from Paris and Bordeaux. But while they might understand each other, how they speak will not exactly be the same. They will be using dialects from where they're from. This so easily explains, I feel, the difference between a language and a dialect. If it's different, but you can understand it, it's a dialect. If you can't understand it at all, it's a language. So with this better understanding of the difference between a language and a dialect, let's go back to Scots. It could be argued that Scots is not a language, but simply a dialect of English. This is because a dialect is defined as a variety of a language spoken in a specific area, and this is how Scots started life, as a version of Old English spoken in Scotland. And going back to David Crystal's idea about people being able to understand each other, it's fairly likely that if someone who only speaks English and someone who only speaks Scots were talking to one another in their respective languages, they would be able to somewhat understand one another. We already looked at some written Scots, and I'm sure many of the people watching this video who speak English could follow it fairly easily, myself included. Does this not all point to Scots just being a dialect of English? Well, here's my retort to that. Scots as a language never really interacted or evolved from the modern English we speak today, or even the Middle English spoken in the Middle Ages. It came about from Old English, as we mentioned. This means that Scots really can't be considered just a dialect of our modern English. If it has to be a dialect of anything, it's a dialect of Old English, and modern English came from Old English too. So is modern English just a dialect of Old English as well, and not a language? And by this logic, we could also call, say, Italian not a real language either, but just a dialect of Latin. I'm sure you get the point I'm trying to make. Defining when something stops being a dialect and starts being a language can be difficult, especially when the argument centers around it being a dialect of a dead language. Personally, I think that this debate of whether Scots is a language or a dialect comes from the fact that Old English is called Old English. If Old English had a completely different name that didn't feature the word English in it, say like Bretonian or just Malcolm, it would make it clear to people that modern English and modern Scots are two different languages that come from the same ancestor, as opposed to the idea they are dialects of each other. That's just my own idea, however. Though it seems that the strongest argument that Scots is a language and not a dialect is simply because people say it is. As mentioned, there's no real definition or regulations declaring when something is a language or a dialect. If enough people insist that Scots is a language, then Scots can be considered a language, and many people have declared it a language. As we started this video with, it's recognised as a language in Scotland itself, and in 1992 it was added to the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, and then in 2001 the UK government ratified this charter, so it is seen as a language by the Scottish government, the UK government, and the EU itself. So yeah, most sources that matter seem to feel that Scots is indeed a language as opposed to a dialect. In Scotland itself, the language is becoming more and more popular, with the 2021 census revealing that more than 1.5 million people in Scotland could speak Scots. The government page on the language refers to it as an important part of Scotland's culture and heritage, appearing in songs, poetry and literature, as well as daily use in our communities. Scots as a language has also become more popular due to the surge in national pride that Scotland has seen in recent years. This surge has come around for a variety of reasons, shall we say. More and more Scottish people wish to speak Scots to celebrate their Scottish heritage. In fact, referring to Scots as a dialect makes many Scottish people wish to speak it and celebrate it even more to celebrate the nation's national identity. Terrific Scottish YouTuber Shay May often tweets in Scots too, it would seem. If you want an understanding of this language in action, maybe go give him a follow to see for yourself. Also, go watch his videos, they're amazing. His 7-hour analysis of Pokemon Omega Ruby is literally my favourite thing on the internet. Honestly, this whole video has just been a massive ploy to plug Shay May. Though, let's wrap things up with Scots, shall we? Perhaps what really cements Scots as a language is the unique words it has. This includes the likes of bairn, meaning a child, neep for turnip, puddock for a frog, and idiot for an idiot, which has also become popular in Ireland too. Hopefully, we can put to rest the idea that Scots is just a dialect of English, and celebrate it for the language it truly is. languages. Spanish and Portuguese have a habit of being geographically close to one another across the globe. We have the nations of Spain and Portugal, where these languages originated from, which are right next to each other, but something similar happens across the Atlantic too, where the Portuguese-speaking Brazil is nestled primarily around the many Spanish-speaking nations of South America, which leads into the Spanish-speaking nations of Central and North America too. Spanish and Portuguese can be found close to one another in other parts of the world too, like in Asia and Africa. Perhaps most noticeably, the small nation of Equatorial Guinea in Africa has both Spanish and Portuguese as an official language. These two languages are like peas in a pod to say the least, yet they are not only close geographically. Spanish and Portuguese are known for being very similar languages and linguistically close to one another too. Just how similar are these two languages? Well, a short answer is pretty darn similar, but not similar enough to be the same language or dialects of one another. The difference between them is big enough for them to be two different languages. The thing most similar between these two languages are the words that make them up. Most sources say that the lexical similarity between Spanish and Portuguese is around 90%. Well, some sources say 89% more specifically, but here at Name Explain we prefer round numbers. This means that many words in Spanish and Portuguese are identical to one another. 9 out of 10 words in fact, if we go by those percentages. If we look at a selection of words and what they translate to in Spanish and Portuguese, we can see that this is indeed the case. Many of the words are identical to one another. This is what people mean when they say that the languages are similar. Languages are more than just a collection of words, however. They have rules like grammar, structure, word order, and gender. Like their words, however, these elements of the Spanish and Portuguese languages are seemingly similar to one another too. Now, note how I say similar as opposed to identical. This is because while there are similarities between these two languages, there are also many minor little differences, with all those small differences adding up to make them different enough to be two different languages. There are slight differences in how things like grammar and gender are used in each of these languages. Most noticeable is with genders. Spanish has 3 genders in its language: male, female, and gender neutral. Portuguese, on the other hand, has just male and female, with no gender neutral language. This lack of gender neutralness in Portuguese could honestly be a video unto itself, but for now, we'll just use it as a good way to highlight the difference between these two languages. There's also minor differences in punctuation too. Noticeably, Portuguese doesn't use upside down question and exclamation marks at the start of sentences in the same way Spanish does. They even have letters not used in each other's languages. For example, this accented C appears in Portuguese and not Spanish, while this accented N appears in Spanish but not Portuguese. Though, weirdly enough, a great place to see the differences in the languages isn't the same place we see the similarities in the languages, in the words themselves. While many words in Spanish and Portuguese are identical to one another, many more are just similar to one another, meaning they're kind of spelt the same way, but with a little difference between them. Take the Spanish and Portuguese words for hello, which are the same, minus the lack of H and accented A in the Portuguese version. Likewise, there are certain word forming elements that are completely different in either language. For example, words that end with ON in Spanish are the same in Portuguese, but instead end with AO. Take the Spanish word for television, televisión, and the Portuguese word of televisión. Likewise, words that start with LL in Spanish instead start with CH in Portuguese, like the Spanish word for rain, llover, and its Portuguese equivalent of chover. However, even when words are spelt identically in both languages, there can still be a difference between them. This is with pronunciation. Pronunciation is actually seen as one of the biggest differences between Spanish and Portuguese, and yes, it's the reason I didn't say any of the words out loud near the start when I was talking about how similar they are. The reason there's a difference in pronunciation is due to the kinds of languages they are. Portuguese is something that is known as a stress-timed language. This means that most words in the language are said with one syllable in particular stressed, normally a vowel sound. This is similar to what happens in English. Spanish, however, is a syllable-timed language, meaning that all syllables are said in roughly the same way. A great example of this is with each language's word for house. They are spelt the same way, but in Spanish, both A's in this word are said said the same way, and the word is pronounced like casa, whereas in Portuguese there is a tad more stress on the first A, meaning the word is pronounced like casa. This is just one of many examples, albeit a somewhat subtle one. So even though many words might look identical on paper between these two languages, when said out loud, they can be quite different. There's also the hilarious false cognates between the two languages. This means words that are spelt and pronounced in a similar way but have completely different meanings. Take polvo in example. In Spanish, polvo means dust, whereas in Portuguese it means octopus. Suffice to say, these are two fairly different meanings. That's just one of many examples of this phenomenon between the languages. There's also pelo, which means dog in Spanish and rusty in Portuguese. Osso, which means bear in Spanish and bone in Portuguese, with a slight spelling alteration. There are also some words in both languages that are just completely different to one another. Some of the most notable examples being the days of the working week. Monday to Friday have completely different names in both languages. Thankfully, the weekend is the same in both languages though. So yes, these languages are similar to one another, but there are also huge differences. That brings us to the question of how intelligible these two languages are between each other. Like, if someone who only spoke Portuguese and someone who only spoke Spanish met up, how well could they talk to each other? Well, the answer to that seems to be a little bit up in the air. If you couldn't guess, I speak neither Spanish nor Portuguese, and this video was primarily made through online research. If you happen to speak either of these languages, please share your experience with the other language down below. Also, this video has mainly stuck to the versions of these languages found in Spain and Portugal. I know that the Spanish spoken in Spain is different to the kind spoken in Colombia, or Mexico, or Argentina. Likewise, the Portuguese spoken in Portugal is different to the Portuguese spoken in Brazil, or Macau, or Mozambique. Anyway, from my online research, I was informed that people who spoke these languages could somewhat understand one another, that they couldn't understand one another, that Portuguese speakers understand Spanish speakers easier than Spanish speakers understand Portuguese speakers, and that these languages were easier understood written as opposed to spoken due to the aforementioned difference in pronunciation. Like I said, this is all kinds of conflicting information, hence why I'd love to hear from actual Spanish and Portuguese speakers down below. I learn just as much from you viewers as I hope you all learn from me in these videos. While that might explain the actual similarities and differences between these two languages, it doesn't really explain why these languages are so similar. Portuguese and Spanish, of course, have a very tight history to one another and originate from the same initial language. More on that later. If we look at a modern chart of the Indo-European language family, we see that both Spanish and Portuguese are Romance languages, along with the likes of French, Italian, and Romanian. They are somewhat different to those languages, however. They sit on a more specific branch of the Romance languages family, dubbed the Western Iberian Romance languages. This includes other, not as well-known languages like Extremaduran, Falar, and Ionavian. These Western Iberian Romance languages are different to other Romance languages due to the relative isolation they evolved in. The geography of the Iberian Peninsula, the land which houses Spain and Portugal, is surrounded by sea, and its only land connection contains the Pyrenees, which made access to this land from other parts of Europe difficult in the past. This allowed the languages here to form in their own unique way, with little interference from the outside world. But of course, there was some interference to get the ball rolling here in the first place. As mentioned, both Spanish and Portuguese come from the same parent language, and as they are Romance languages, I'm sure you figured out that they both descend from Latin. Well, Vulgar Latin to be exact. Vulgar Latin was the kind of Latin spoken by common people in the wider Roman Empire. Romans arrived on the Iberian Peninsula in around the 200s BC. Prior to this, many other languages were being spoken here, which are now all long gone. Vulgar Latin changed all across the Roman Empire, though in each region those changes were different. It's believed that Vulgar Latin would have been used intermixed with the native languages being spoken there at the time. These mixtures of Vulgar Latin and native languages would become the modern Romance languages we know today. But a little bit more happened on the Iberian Peninsula. When Rome fell, the Visigoths took over the peninsula with their Gothic language. This Gothic language did not seem to catch on with the masses, who still used their own mangled version of Vulgar Latin. This version of Vulgar Latin most likely picked up words from Gothic, however. Eventually, by the 8th century AD, the Arabic Moors took over a large part of the peninsula, with Arabic replacing Gothic as the language of the elite. The common people of the peninsula didn't speak Arabic, however. They instead carried on with their Vulgar Latin, which did get influenced by Arabic, however, and took on the name of Mozarabic, which is a unique Romance language that's an interesting mix of Latin and Arabic. The Moors did not take over the entire peninsula, however. The northwest region of the peninsula remained independent and free from Arabic rule, and was called the Kingdom of Asturias. This kingdom was made up of the modern regions of Asturias and Galicia. Galicia even at the time had a more unique identity, as it still does today. As this area wasn't taken over by Arabic speakers, it meant that the Vulgar Latin being spoken here continued to develop, becoming something that we will dub for clarity's sake as Galician Vulgar Latin, which is different to the aforementioned Mozarabic being spoken on the rest of the peninsula at the time. The Kingdom of Asturias wanted to reclaim as much of the Iberian Peninsula as possible from the Moors, and at the end of the 9th century, a nobleman named Vimala Perez led a force that claimed back a large area of land on the west of the peninsula. The King of Asturias was so happy with Perez's work that he awarded that land to Perez as a county. Perez named this county after the largest port within it, Portus Calais, which was corrupted into Portugal, giving us the birth of the modern nation. This county of Portugal over the years took on its own unique identity, claimed more land down the western coast of the peninsula, and the Vulgar Latin being spoken there evolved in its own unique way. This of course led to the creation of the modern Portuguese language as we know it today. At the same time Portugal and the Portuguese language was forming in the west of the peninsula, change was happening elsewhere in the land too. The Kingdom of Asturias split into smaller successor states. The most dominant of those successor states became the Kingdom of Leon and Castile. This kingdom too had their own version of Vulgar Latin they spoke, which derived from the Kingdom of Asturias Galician Vulgar Latin, that once again for clarity's sake we will call Castilla Vulgar Latin. This kingdom eventually reclaimed the peninsula from the Moors, minus the part that formed into Portugal of course, and the version of Vulgar Latin they spoke became modern Spanish, wiping out the aforementioned Mozarabic form of Vulgar Latin too. To this day, the standard form of Spanish spoken in Spain is sometimes referred to as Castilian Spanish. This all resulted in the modern languages we have today, which have then spread across the globe through empire and colonization. So to recap all that, Latin arrived on the Iberian Peninsula via the Romans. It got corrupted into Vulgar Latin there. The Visigoths and Arabic Moors reduced the presence of Latin as an official language on the peninsula, everywhere but in the northwestern kingdom of Asturias, whose form of Vulgar Latin went on to become Galician Vulgar Latin. Galician Vulgar Latin found a new home in the county of Portugal, which was seized by the Moors by the Kingdom of Asturias. This county of Portugal eventually became a kingdom, and the Galician Vulgar Latin spoken there became modern Portuguese. At the same time, the Kingdom of Asturias split into smaller states, one of those being the Kingdom of Leon and Castile, which spoke their own version of Galician Vulgar Latin, we called Castile Vulgar Latin. They then reclaimed most of the peninsula from the Moors and eventually became one kingdom, and Castile Vulgar Latin became modern Spanish. Just a little bit confusing to say the least. But what I hope you realised through my garbled retelling of the history of the Iberian Peninsula is that both languages derived from Vulgar Latin, more specifically Galician Vulgar Latin, but then split to become the unique, albeit somewhat similar, languages that they are today. Gosh, I think I need a little siesta after all that. Was only made legal in England and Wales in 1967, and even at this point the Sexual Offences Act of this year only decriminalised sex between men, not women, and the age of consent was 21. Now to many watching, 1967 might seem like quite a long time ago, but in reality it was just over 50 years ago or so. Let's put that into perspective. Famous gay British men such as Elton John, Stephen Fry and Ian McKellen were all born before their sexual orientation was even illegal. People were obviously still gay before it was decriminalized. So how did these men, as this video will primarily be focusing on gay men due to the very nature of it, get away with being able to love the people that they did? Well, it all had to be done in secrecy, and this secrecy even included a special language that gay men used to talk to one another so they could speak about their orientation in public without being caught by the likes of undercover police. Now I say language, but perhaps a better term like slang or cant might be a tad more fitting. Whatever the case, we'll be using the term of language to refer to it in this video, and this language is called Polari. Polari was primarily used in the United Kingdom, London to be exact. So why does it have such a non-English sounding name? Well, the name of the language actually comes from Italian, from their word of parlare, meaning to talk, which makes sense as languages are all about talking. The language has its roots in the 19th century, but there's evidence that it goes back even further. In the 16th century, Shakespeare used the term of bona, meaning good in his play, Henry IV Part 2. Bona is a mainstay of Polari. We don't know, however, if Will was using Polari, or if Polari picked up this term from him. Polari has deep links to the theatre, however, so that could explain the link, but more on the theatre later. Polari is actually derived from a mixture of different languages and slangs. It borrows from Italian, hence why the name is of Italian roots, as well as Romani, Cockney rhyming slang, Yiddish, and even thieves' cant, which was another secretive language used by thieves to evade the law, in the same way gay men use Polari. Some terms in Polari have more unique origins, however. Take the Polari word of eek. This means face. This term derives from the spelling of the word somewhat backwards as ikafe, then shortening it to just eek. You will also see eek spelled as eek, E-E-K. That's because this was a secretive language, meaning it wasn't all that well documented. Many words of Polari have multiple spellings, perhaps the most well-known example being zhuzh, which means to make something look more presentable, used often with clothing and hair. The word has a boatload of spelling variations, ranging from how I just spelled it to Z-H-U-Z-H, to Z-H-O-O-S-H, to Z-H-U-S-H, to J-O-O-Z-H, to Z-H-O-O-Z-H, to Z-H-O-O-S, to even T-J-U-Z, just to name a few examples. Polari was used for more than just occasional words, however. Entire sentences could be formed more or less with just Polari, a famous one being the sentence of "Bona te vada, you dolly old eek," which translates into meaning "nice to see your pretty old face." This line comes from a 1960s radio show called Round the Horn, which starred Hugh Paddick and carry-on legend Kenneth Williams. As to how many Polari words actually are, it's somewhat debated. Most sources agree that most gay men would have had a lexicon of around just 20 Polari words they would use regularly. However, lists of Polari words can go up to around 500. Despite the language being so linked with British gay men now, it didn't actually originate with the homosexual community. The language has its origins across London, in places like fish markets, fairgrounds and circuses. These kinds of places often contain people from all across the globe interacting with one another. Fairgrounds and circuses in particular were often run by Romani speakers, hence why Romani is such an influence on Polari. Another place Polari was used heavily in the 19th century was in the theatres of London. Theatres also had a habit of drawing in workers from all across the globe. Another group of people linked with the theatre are homosexual men. For a large variety of reasons, gay men have worked in the theatre for a very long time. The theatre has been a welcoming safe space for gay men, where they would not be judged or demonized for their sexuality. Sexuality and gender has always been more accepting in the theatre too, going as far back as men playing the roles of women in Shakespeare's time. It was through the theatres that gay men picked up on Polari, and in turn started to use it as their own secret language in and out of the theatre. One of the more pivotal places where Polari was used was during Punch and Judy shows. Now, I'm not too sure how well known of Punch and Judy is outside of the UK, but these are puppet shows that feature the characters of Punch and Judy, as well as an assortment of other characters too. They usually feature slapstick comedy and can seem a little outdated at times too now, but they remain pretty popular, still being seen at fairs to this day. Punch and Judy shows would often travel around the country, meaning the Polari used in them would be heard by people all across the United Kingdom. In particular, it will be heard by children, as they were the target audience for these shows. Polari remained a popular popular underground language from its inception with the homosexual community until around the middle of the 20th century. By the 1960s, change was finally coming to the UK in regards to their views on homosexuality. As mentioned, by 1967, homosexual acts between men were decriminalised. With it no longer being illegal, the need for a secret language wasn't all that necessary. But even before then, the secret of Polari as a gay language was already somewhat out in the open. Its use in public circles had become increasingly common. That aforementioned Round the Horn radio show was produced in the 60s, and Polari was used all the time in it. At its peak, this show had around 20 million listeners per show, meaning millions upon millions of people were hearing it and starting to understand what the words meant. Polari as a secret language for the gay men of Britain died off when it was no longer illegal to be gay. Though of course legalizing homosexuality didn't mean that all of a sudden people were just cool with it. Gay men and women in the UK and across the globe still face huge issues that need to be addressed. While being legal, homosexuality was still seen as taboo in the UK. The then Home Secretary of the UK, Roy Jenkins, even said on the matter of homosexuality when it was legalised that those who suffer from this disability carry a great weight of shame all their lives, which is honestly heartbreaking to hear. The stigma around homosexuality in the UK carried on throughout the 20th century. Noticeably with the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, with gay men being seen as the culprits behind it all. Civil partnerships between gay people were only legalized in 2005, and it wasn't until 2014 that marriage was made legal between gay people in the UK. It's been a long, continuous challenge to say the least, but at least gay men don't need to use a secretive language anymore. But here's the thing, Polari hasn't really gone away all that much. While not really used as a full language in this day and age, many words that originated from Polari are still used pretty regularly, especially here in the United Kingdom, and these terms are pretty much used by everyone, as opposed to just gay people. There are many words that you probably may already know about, and may even use today, that derive from Polari. A favourite of mine has to be naff. Naff is a word meaning something is low quality, or just a bit rubbish really. E.g., that new movie was a bit naff. I use it all the time and had no idea that it came from Polari. Other words like butch meaning manly, camp meaning effeminate, and mint meaning to walk in a specific way, all come from Polari too. Bevy meaning a drink also stems from Polari as well. However, it's simply a shortening of beverage, so that might have come about anyway. As Polari has links with sexuality, it means there are some more sensitive words, shall we say. I won't explain them fully here because YouTube might demonetize me, but a notable example is blow. Blow has a specific meaning I'm sure many of you might be familiar with, and that comes from Polari. Apologies to anyone who might be watching this in a classroom with a teacher, or with parents for that one. But honestly, it's important to remember the fact that this language had to be used to discuss things like this, because it was illegal to do so otherwise. As far as I'm aware, many of these Polari terms are primarily used in just the UK, but there is one word from Polari that has become popular across the globe. Undoubtedly, Polari's biggest success has to be the word of drag. Drag initially in Polari just meant clothing, but it then went on to mean more specifically men wearing traditional female clothing, and eventually vice versa too. The OED defines drag in this way as feminine attire worn by a man, also a party or dance attended by men wearing feminine attire, and has its earliest recorded evidence of it being used in this way from a newspaper in 1870 saying, "We shall come in drag." Drag can be used on its own in this way to this day, with phrases like dressed in drag or wearing drag being commonplace. However, it really picked up steam when it was attached to the word of queen. A drag queen is someone, usually a man, dressed in women's clothing, usually in a very eccentric manner. Drag and drag queens of course are linked back to the days of theatre with men playing women. However, in more recent years, drag has become far more celebrated and loved across the globe, primarily thanks to a certain Drag Race television series. Now drag can be seen all over the place, with drag events like drag brunches and drag nights being commonplace. Most English speakers today understand what drag is in this sense, and it all derives from this secret language for gay British men. Polari has made its way into everyday talk in the English language. Likewise, many gay people around the world now find themselves being able to share their sexuality with little discrimination. And while it's far from perfect, we've come a long way. Polari can serve as a reminder of sorts to the discrimination gay people have faced throughout history. This language helped gay men talk about themselves and the one they loved in public spaces, in a time they otherwise could not. Happy Pride Month to all Name Explain viewers. modern Europe are pretty uniform in a lot of ways. Most derive from the Indo-European family tree of languages that can all be put neatly into groups within that family, like the Romance languages of French and Spanish, the Germanic languages of Dutch and German, the Slavic languages of Polish and Czech, and so on. There are of course, however, some languages found in Europe that don't conform in this way. Take Albanian in example. While part of the Indo-European family of languages, it sits alone on a branch with no other living relatives. Then we also have the Uralic languages of Europe, most noticeably Hungarian, Finnish and Estonian. While these three are all related to one another, they aren't part of the Indo-European tree. And there's of course also Maltese, Europe's very own Arabic language, as we've talked about before. But there's one language in Europe in particular that bucks the trend of all the other languages of Europe in a very odd way. On top of this is a seriously perplexing, mysterious, confusing, ancient and bewildering language. This is of course the language of Basque. Basque is an absolutely wild language in so many ways. Basque is spoken by the Basque people in the Basque country, an area of Europe in the west of the Pyrenees that straddles between Spain and France, though primarily within Spain. One of Spain's autonomous communities is called Basque Country, and yes, it resides within the wider Basque Country area. The perplexing things about Basque begin with its very origins, and that's because we have no idea where it comes from. It has no relation to any other language. We know this because its words sound nothing like the words of other nearby languages. Take the French and Spanish word for big, grande. These are more or less identical to one another, so we can assume that these languages must be related in some way, shape or form. The Basque word for big, however, is hondia. This sounds nothing like the French or Spanish word for big, nor any other language's word for big, so we can assume that is a completely isolated language. What makes this even wilder is the fact that Basque is nestled between France and Spain, so the fact this language sounds nothing like either of those makes it even more perplexing as to how it's so isolated. The leading theory on the origin of the Basque language is that it comes from an ancient long-lost language that we have dubbed Iberian. This language of Iberian eventually died out, but Basque continued being spoken, though that's just a theory on the matter. As to why this language is so isolated, well, the leading theory in that case revolves around the geography of the land in which it is spoken. Basque country is nestled within the Pyrenees as mentioned, and this mountain range could be pretty inaccessible, especially in the ancient past. This means that the Basque language could evolve in an isolated environment, and conversely, people who spoke other languages couldn't easily get to the ancient Basque speakers, so the language couldn't be influenced by outside tongues. Basque, as mentioned, is also super old, older than things like Old English, Old High German, Latin, Old Church Slavonic. In fact, it predates every Indo-European language in Europe, as we shall talk about. It's widely considered to be the oldest living language in Europe. It's believed to date back to Neolithic times as a language spoken by hunter-gatherers. Basically, it's super old, super unique, and super mysterious. Basque is such an anomaly in the realm of European languages that there's even a myth involving a certain someone trying to learn this language but to no avail. Basque is seen as a very difficult language to learn due to how unique it is, as it has no relation to other languages. For example, if you wanted to learn Spanish but already knew Portuguese, things would be a little bit easier for you because they are related. This isn't the case with Basque, as there's no other languages it relates to. Someone who once, according to myth, tried to learn the language was none other than the devil himself. The devil wanted to learn Basque so he could corrupt the people of the Basque country and send them to hell. However, after 7 years of trying to learn it, he gave up as it was too complex even for him. This is why Basque has also become known as the language the devil couldn't learn. It's quite the feat for a language to be so complex and different that even Satan gave up on it. Basque wouldn't have always been such a strange anomaly, however. In Europe's past, there would have been other languages like Basque, ones that didn't relate to any other languages. These kinds of languages are known as pre-Indo-European languages because they were the languages spoken in Europe before Indo-European languages took over the continent. Basque is the sole surviving pre-Indo-European language in Europe. While its contemporaries are no more, Basque has been able to outlive the them all and is still spoken to this very day. According to Wikipedia, there are around 750,000 speakers of the language today, with 343,000 of them being able to speak it passively, and 6,000 of them being monoglots. This means that there are 6,000 people on our planet who only speak this ancient mysterious language. If you happen to be one of those 6,000, please let me know. But I guess you can't understand what I'm saying right now. My bad. The fact that Basque has survived into the modern day just adds to the enigma of it all. There have been plenty of chances over the millennia for this language to be wiped out like many other pre-Indo-European languages, but it wasn't. The first thing that could have wiped it out was the Indo-European migrations. These are a series of hypothetical migrations around Europe that potentially explain to us how Indo-European languages became the mainstay of the continent, and in turn wiped out many of the pre-Indo-European languages. These migrations are thought to have happened from around 4000 BC to 1000 BC, yet for some unknown reason, these migrations never made their way to the Basque country. This was probably because of just how isolated the Basque country is. It's surrounded by mountains, as mentioned, so those early migrators probably wouldn't be able to settle there, allowing the Basque language and people to flourish, while the other tongues of Europe radically changed. The Basque language stayed isolated for thousands of years after that. The next potential threat to the language came in 196 BC. This is when the Romans finally arrived in the Iberian Peninsula in the midst of the Punic Wars. The Roman Republic, which would become the Empire, had a huge influence on Europe, one that set many of the modern borders and languages of Europe to this day. What's interesting about Rome is that while they claimed huge parts of Europe, they actually let many of the cultures they claimed carry on just doing their thing, as opposed to forcing Roman culture on them. It's one of the reasons why the Empire lasted as long as it did. Despite this, however, the Latin language still influenced many parts of the Empire, giving us the modern Romance languages today, which usurped the native pre-Indo-European languages once spoken there. This of course didn't happen to the Basque language. Rome did have possession over the Basque country, but the language survived. This is because the Basques and the Romans became key allies. Together they defended the Iberian Peninsula from the Celts and other Iberian tribes. The Basque country and the language thrived during its time under Roman rule, unlike many other languages during that time period. Of course, Western Rome would eventually meet its demise, and the Basque country wouldn't ever be as dominant as it was during this time. During the Middle Ages, the Iberian Peninsula saw all kinds of powers claim its land, from Germanic tribes to the Islamic invasions of the 8th century AD. Yet despite all this, thanks to its proud heritage and isolated location, the language was able to carry on being spoken during all this upheaval. Something that really helped the Basque language and identity find protection were a series of laws that were put in place during this time, known as the Fuero. These highlighted how important it was for the Basque country to maintain its own degree of autonomy. This greatly helped the language maintain itself and protect itself from outsiders. The language faced its biggest threat, however, years after, when Spain came under the rule of dictator Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War in the 20th century. During this time, Franco banned the Basque language, calling it an enemy of God. This is because he forced the use of Spanish language above everything else. With this ban in place, the language did start to dwindle, but it was still spoken by small pockets of people in secrecy. And thanks to this undying support, once the language was unbanned, it meant it still had speakers who could help revive the language. This all means that this supremely resilient language that could easily have been erased from our planet on numerous occasions is still around to this very day. It's absolutely wild. Every single aspect of this language is perplexing, from its prehistoric origins to its isolation, lack of connection to any other language, and to the fact that it's still around to this day. And you know what? I love it for that. Basque gives us an insight into what language was like in Europe from a time before the likes of the Romans, and even before Indo-European languages were really a thing. And of course, we have to talk about that name. This is name explain after all. It should come as no surprise that we aren't entirely sure as to where the name Basque comes from. The leading theory on it is that it might mean something like foresters, but we aren't entirely sure. Though of course, as I'm sure many of you know, the final confusing thing about this language is that in Basque, Basque isn't called Basque. It is instead called Euskara. Like with the name Basque, this one too comes from equally unknown roots. Basque is undoubtedly one of the biggest mysteries in the world of language, and it seems for the time being, many of the mysteries surrounding this language will remain unsolved. Between languages in nations where the most popular religion is Christianity, and it all has to do with the denomination of Christianity that is most popular in that nation. The pattern seems to be that whatever denomination of Christianity is most popular in that country dictates what language family the most widely spoken language in that nation comes from, or vice versa I suppose. It's kind of hard to explain in a succinct way without just explaining these correlations, so let's just do that, shall we? What this means is that if a country primarily speaks a language from the Germanic language family, then the most popular denomination of Christianity in that nation will be Protestantism, while if the country primarily speaks a language from the Romance language family, then the most popular denomination will instead be Catholicism. And finally, if the country speaks a Slavic language, then the most popular denomination will instead be Orthodoxy. This primarily applies to Europe, but does reflect in other modern nations which were heavily influenced by European colonization, as we shall see later in this video. The reason this primarily applies to Europe is because Christianity is the largest religion in Europe, and because it's the continent where the religion really grew in prominence many years ago, despite the fact it truly originated in Asia, specifically in the Middle East. Three great examples of nations that obeyed this denomination/language divide are the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. All three of these nations have different denominations of Christianity as their most popular religion, and all three speak different languages which are from three different families. In the United Kingdom, the most popular denomination of Christianity is Protestantism, and the nation's most popular language of English is from the Germanic language family. France's most popular denomination of Christianity is Catholicism, and French is of course a Romance language. And lastly, in Russia, Orthodoxy is the most popular denomination of Christianity, with Russian not only being a Slavic language, but the most widely spoken Slavic language of them all. I'm sure by now you're starting to see this pattern and realize it for yourself when thinking about other nations. Places like Spain and Portugal are also primarily Catholic, whereas nations like Germany are mainly Protestant. Though of course this rule isn't set in stone. There are Germanic Catholics, Romance Protestants, and so on out there. I find it so fascinating that the language and Christian denomination dividing lines are pretty much one and the same in Europe. How did this even happen? Well, it's kind of a coincidence. It's not like the speakers of all the language families got together and decided to follow that denomination of Christianity. A conscious effort was never put in place to make things happen this way. This phenomenon more comes down to the geography of the land, which played a large role in dictating how languages and Christianity spread. And of course, history relating to Christianity in these nations played a role too. Many of these nations once followed a different denomination, before converting to another one for one reason or another. Obviously, to begin with, Christianity wasn't formed of many different denominations. It actually started life as a sect unto itself of Judaism, before expanding into its own religion. From here it spread all across Europe, finding itself being followed in many different languages. The first big division in the religion happened in 1054 AD. By this point, Christianity was already around 1,000 years old, so been around for quite a long time. This divide in the religion happened between those worshipping it in the eastern side of Europe and the western side. There wasn't one factor that led to this division in the religion, but rather a whole myriad of reasons, including things such as how much authority the Pope should have, and even debating what kind of bread should be used in communion. This split is known as the Great Schism, and gave birth to the first two major denominations of Christianity: Roman Catholicism, known as just the Catholic Church, and Eastern Orthodoxy, known as just the Orthodox Church. We don't need to go into what exactly these names mean, as we have a whole video dedicated to Christian denomination names, so go watch that if you fancy it. What we will go into, however, is where exactly this division took place from a geographical perspective. The divide went pretty much across modern Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Catholicism in the West and Orthodoxy in the East. This should already start to make you understand how the correlation between language families and denominations took place. Let's first focus on Catholicism and the Romance languages. Catholicism is the branch of Christianity most linked with Rome. The head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, resides within a small separate nation within the city of Rome itself to this day. Of course, the language of Rome was Latin, and to this day, Latin still plays a vital role in Catholicism, being seen as the denomination's official language. Latin is of course a Romance language, and most of the modern Romance languages on our planet have Latin as their key ancestor, and the nations that speak those Romance languages were once key parts of the Roman Empire. This includes nations and languages like France/French, Spain/Spanish, Portugal/Portuguese, and of course Italy/Italian. While the Roman Empire covered way more than just these modern nations, it could be argued that these were the nations that were influenced by Rome the most, not only in the fact that their languages resemble Latin the most, but also because they carried on following the kind of Christianity with deep ties to Rome too. That is a very oversimplified way of explaining why Catholicism is most abundant in Romance-speaking nations. A very similar story happened in Eastern Europe too, but with Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism. Orthodoxy doesn't have a home base in the same way the Catholic Church does. There's no one leader based in one micronation that resides within one city. The denomination, however, is seen as originating in the Slavic-speaking part of Eastern Europe, and from the Great Schism, it spread across other Slavic-speaking people too, eventually becoming the dominant denomination of Christianity in Eastern Europe, and especially with Slavic-speaking people/nations like Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, Bulgaria, and North Macedonia. Once again, that's a very simplified explanation of Orthodoxy in Slavic speakers, but I'm sure by now you're starting to understand how this all came to be. The denomination comes into being in a specific place, then spreads from that area. And of course, not only does geography help it spread, but language does too. Languages from the same family can be similar enough to one another to be understood by speakers to some extent. For example, a person who speaks Spanish and a person who speaks French might be able to understand one another due to some shared words between the two languages, as they are both from the Romance family. This shared understanding could have helped these denominations spread more easily too. It's easier for Slavic speakers to explain Orthodoxy to one another than a Slavic speaker trying to explain to a Romance speaker who are living on other sides of the continent, right? That's just my own theory on the matter anyway. This puts us in a very nice position of having Catholicism in the West and Orthodoxy in the East, yet there's a third cog in this machine, that being the Germanic/Protestant cog. Germanic speaking nations like Germany and the UK are considered part of Western Europe undoubtedly, and for some time these Germanic countries fell under the Catholic banner too. This changed, however, in 1517 when the Protestant Reformations began in Germany. This was kicked off by Martin Luther, who grew tired of the way in which the church was running things and how much money they were making through people to pay for things like palaces and cathedrals. He wanted to take Christianity back to somewhat basics and remove the hierarchical power of the Catholic Church. This led to the creation of Protestantism, and this denomination quickly spread across Germany at the time. So once again, this is simply a case of a denomination originating from one place that spoke a language from a specific family, and it spreading to its neighbours who also spoke a language from that family. Protestantism, however, is interesting. Firstly, because it arrived way later to the game. By the time it got on the scene, many of these Germanic countries were already Catholic. And secondly, it's worth mentioning that Protestantism isn't one singular denomination like Catholicism. Protestantism is split into smaller groups, like the Church of England in the UK for example, which is a sub-denomination of Protestantism. Weird, huh? But with Protestantism being born to Germanic speakers, we can start to understand how it reached other Germanic speaking people. Of course, you have the Scandinavian countries to Germany's north, who had long had cultural ties with one another. So once word of the Reformation reached Northern Europe from Germany, the adoption of it happened quickly, even reaching Iceland. And of course, Protestantism reached us here in the UK, which is a whole story unto itself, involving one King Henry VIII and his desire to divorce his wife, something the Catholic Church wouldn't let him do, so he made his own church instead based on Protestantism, which he had heard about from the continent. And that kind of explains to us the language/denomination split of Christianity. It's partly a coincidence and partly thanks to people sharing their ideas with nearby people who could vaguely understand them. And of course these splits occurred outside of Europe too, due to colonization. South and Central America were primarily colonized by Romance speakers, meaning Catholicism is the most popular denomination there. Likewise, the USA was shaped by the British, meaning Protestantism is the biggest form of Christianity there too. Canada is a really interesting case. One source told me that among English-speaking Canadians, Protestantism is more popular, but with French Canadians, Catholicism holds out, which once again ties in with those language-religious divides. Similar trends appear in Africa too, like how Nigeria is primarily Protestant, which ties into its time under British rule. This is all well and good, but what I find equally interesting are the nations that don't follow this trend. There are nations in Europe that primarily speak a tongue of one language, where the dominant denomination isn't the one you'd expect it to be from the trend we've laid out already. Out of these rule-breaking nations, Ireland comes to mind first and foremost for me. Its main language is English, which is Germanic, but of course their most popular denomination is Catholicism. This is for a whole mess of reasons which I'm sure you partially know about already, and we don't really need to go into them here. Likewise, we have Poland. Despite Polish being a Slavic language, the country is super Catholic. Other Slavic nations that are Catholic instead of Orthodox as we might expect include Croatia, Slovakia and Slovenia. This is because these Slavic speaking nations have close ties with the ancient Roman Empire. On the other side of the spectrum we have Romania, which despite being a Romance speaking nation is very Orthodox due to its location in Eastern Europe. Greece is also super Orthodox too and not a Slavic speaking nation, with Greek kind of being its own thing. Then there's the case of the Netherlands. Dutch is a Germanic language, and while Protestantism is the preferred church of the monarchy there, Catholicism is slightly more popular. And finally, I have to mention Malta, which is a super Catholic country. Yet Maltese isn't a Romance language, neither is a Germanic or Slavic language. It's a Semitic language of all things. Maybe this language denomination thing isn't as concrete as I first thought when I began writing this video. Seen as being connected to one another, being grouped together into families. Language families show us how languages relate to one another and are pieced together through similar words and grammar and by looking into their shared history. The largest single language family on our planet is the Indo-European language family. It contains over 150 languages in its many branches, and 3 billion people on our planet speak an Indo-European language. Languages within the Indo-European language family range from Hindi to German to Polish to Manx. Seriously, it's wild that languages as different as Hindi and Manx are considered to be part of the same family, albeit very distant cousins of one another. The Indo side of the Indo-European family is fascinating unto itself, but today we're focusing more on the European half of this family. Indo-European languages dominate Europe. Most European countries have some kind of Indo-European language as their main tongue, whether that be the UK's English, Spain's Spanish, or even Ukraine's Ukrainian. It would be easy to presume that every language in Europe is Indo-European, but that isn't the case at all. There's actually a selection of languages spoken in Europe that are not from the huge Indo-European family tree, or as I called them in the title of this video, European languages that aren't European. These languages instead came from families from outside of the continent, or instead formed in isolated manners within the continent. Some are pretty popular languages spoken by millions, while others are only spoken by a small group within a nation. So, how on earth did these non-European languages end up in Europe? Well, the simplest answer to that question is with the one word of migration. Groups of people have migrated all across this planet, calling new places home. When they travel, they bring their languages with them, and those languages change and split into new ones. This is how the majority of language diversity came into being. In Europe, in most cases, languages would simply migrate around the continent. For example, Latin spread into Western Europe and the Iberian Peninsula, where it evolved into French, Portuguese, and so on. These kinds of migrations explain to us why so many European languages are related to one another. But there have been cases of languages migrating from outside of Europe and making their home in the continent. There's no better example of this than with the Uralic language family. The Uralic languages form an entirely separate language family from the Indo-European one. They're not a branch of it in the same way Romance or Slavic are. This means that the Uralic languages have no relation to languages like English or Polish. There are around 40 different Uralic languages, with most of them being spoken in Europe, although some reside in Northern Asia. Actually, quick side note, I'm probably going to be saying that a lot of these languages are spoken in Asia too, quite a bit in this video, simply due to the fact that most of these non-European European languages reside in the transcontinental region between Europe and Asia, which makes sense due to the very nature of this topic. Anyway, 3 Uralic languages are undoubtedly spoken mainly in Europe, those being the 3 most known of ones, Finnish, Estonian, and the single most popular Uralic language, Hungarian. What's interesting here is the geographic split in these languages. You'd expect languages of the same family to be close to one another, and while Estonia and Finland are, Hungary is much further south. Hungary has no Uralic speaking neighbours, instead being bordered by Slavic, Romance, and Germanic speaking nations. How Hungarian got separated from its Uralic cousins origins could be a video unto itself, and it nearly was until I couldn't quite figure it all out, so I decided to put it on the back burner and put more research into it and quickly made this video instead. However, Hungarian, Estonian and Finnish are not the only Uralic languages out there. There's languages like Mari, spoken in European Russia, and of course the various Sami languages which are spoken across northern Scandinavia. The Uralic languages are theorized to have their origins in the Ural mountain range, which resides in modern-day Russia. This explains to us why they are known as the Uralic languages too. The Ural mountains have historically been seen as a natural dividing line between Europe and Asia in this part of the world. Where exactly Europe ends and Asia begins is a debated subject, and I already mentioned it will come up in this video. We have historically used geographic features to denote borders of these continents, and the Ural mountains are another example of that. It's believed that Proto-Uralic, the hypothesized OG Uralic language, left the Ural mountains thousands of years ago, with different groups of people migrating to different parts of Europe. As they moved, the language evolved and became new branches of the Uralic language family. The Baltic Finnic branch emerged in northern Europe, which gave us Finnish and Estonian, while the Ugric branch gave us Hungarian. There are even more branches of the Uralic family, however, like the Sami branch, which houses the Sami languages. This is how a distinctly non-European language ended up in Europe, especially in the case of Hungarian, which is more or less in the center of the continent. That's a resoundingly oversimplified account of how the Uralic languages arrived in Europe. Like I said, it will be a full video once I fully figure out myself. Another language family I've dedicated an entire video to, however, well, kind of, is the Turkic family. Like the Uralic, this too has nothing to do with Indo-European, but still has a presence on the continent. Once again, the Turkic languages can be found in the transcontinental area between Europe and Asia. Most Turkic languages found in Europe are in nations that are only partially in Europe. A prime example of this being the language of Turkish. Only 3% of Turkey's landmass is considered to be part of Europe, yet it's the land that houses half of the country's most iconic city, Istanbul. The city is split between the Bosphorus Strait, which is another one of those natural borders between Asia and Europe. While Turkish is the definitive Turkic language for many of us, it is not the only one. Azerbaijani, spoken in Azerbaijan, is a Turkic language too, and Azerbaijan is also partially within Europe. Likewise, parts of Kazakhstan are seen as being in Europe, and their language of Kazakh is a Turkic tongue too. There are smaller Turkic languages like Tatar spoken in European Russia, which is different to Crimean Tatar spoken in Crimea. There's even Gagauz, which is spoken in an area of Moldova. Once again, we have migration to thank for the emergence of these languages in Europe. The Turkic languages are believed to have originated all the way over in modern-day Mongolia. These Proto-Turkic speakers went on a huge journey to get to Europe's border. As they migrated, they left a path of Turkic languages in their wake. This included ones like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan too, which are found in Asia, but still Turkic. Like I said, we have a whole video on these guys. Uralic and Turkic languages are the best examples of languages from non-Indo-European that have made themselves at home in Europe. Yet there are a few more out there. Take an example, the language of Georgian, which is primarily spoken in Georgia, once again found in that transcontinental nook of the world. Georgian isn't a Turkic language, nor is it Uralic. It is instead Kartvelian. I had never heard of this family until researching this video, and Georgian is seemingly the most spoken language within it by a long shot. Unlike the Uralic and Turkic families, however, this one did not migrate to Europe. It instead seemingly developed in this part of the world completely on its own. I imagine this language could have come into being without being part of the Indo-European family due to the fact that it originated in the Caucasus mountain region. This would make its speakers fairly isolated from others and allowed the language to blossom without interference. This is very much like what we saw with the Uralic languages coming from the Ural mountains too. Man, mountains have really had a history of birthing languages, haven't they? This is the case with another language found in Europe that isn't Indo-European. Basque. Basque, as I said in a whole video dedicated to the tongue, is a wild language. It's found in a region of modern-day Spain, and not only is it non-Indo-European, it has no relation to any other language out there. Like with Georgian, it's believed to have flourished due to the isolation of the Basque country and its mountains. Europe is even home to a couple Semitic languages, which are part of the Afro-Asiatic language family and not Indo-European either. Most noticeably, we have Maltese. This is the main language of the island nation of Malta. This language is really unique in the fact that while it is Semitic, it is written with the Latin alphabet, which makes it unique amongst Semitic languages. The reason this phenomenon came into being is all due to Malta's location. The islands are nestled neatly between Italy and North Africa. Interactions from both these places gave way to this very unique Indo-European language. While Maltese is often cited as Europe's only native Semitic language, there is kind of another, that being Cypriot Arabic. This is a variety of Arabic spoken in Cyprus, and it is spoken by less than 10,000 people. But nevertheless, it can count as another non-European language spoken within Europe. Is infamously a very confusing language to learn, whether that be speaking it, writing it, or reading it, especially as a non-native to the language. One of the main reasons Japanese can be so confusing for people learning it is due to the fact that in its written form, it has 3 different writing systems, and Japanese writing tends to fluctuate between the 3 of them without much warning or notice. The 3 writing systems are called hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Those first 2 of hiragana and katakana are the closest we have to an alphabet like the Latin one. The characters of these syllabaries, also known as kana, represent specific sounds and symbols. For example, this kana of hiragana and this kana of katakana both make a sound similar to the sound of the Latin alphabet, and while the standard Latin alphabet has 26 characters, hiragana and katakana both have around 46 standard characters each. That's just shy of 100 sound-based characters across 2 syllabaries you have to know. And you may be thinking, why are there 2 of these? We saw that both hiragana and katakana have symbols that represent the A sound, so why not just have 1? These 2 syllabaries exist because they are used for different kinds of words. To explain them in a very oversimplified manner, hiragana is used for native Japanese words, while katakana is used for foreign words, which have been introduced to Japanese. This makes katakana words kind of fun in my eyes. They often sound like broken English version of words. In example, the Japanese word for announcer is written in katakana and is pronounced as announcer. That's already quite confusing to say the least. 2 syllabaries which feature similar sounds represented with different characters which have use depending on the origin of the word. Yet, then we have kanji, which is a whole different beast unto itself. Kanji characters do not represent specific sounds like we see in hiragana and katakana. Instead, these symbols represent entire words or ideas. For example, this kanji character means forest, and what's extra cute about it is that it's made up of 3 of the kanji symbols for trees, which reflects the fact a forest is a collection of trees. Kanji is difficult for a few reasons. First off, there are thousands upon thousands of kanji symbols, with some sources claiming there are around 50,000 of these little guys. It's pretty much impossible for a native Japanese speaker to know every single symbol of kanji, let alone someone learning it as a foreign language. The other big issue with kanji is that you can't really figure out what a symbol says without already being told what it means. As mentioned, kanji is logographic. The symbols don't represent the sounds they make when said out loud. You can't sound out a kanji symbol or anything like that. The only way you are going to know what a piece of kanji means is if you have previously been taught that specific piece of kanji already. If you come across some kanji you have never seen before and there's no one around to tell you what it means, you're screwed. Except you would be screwed if Japanese hadn't already figured out a way to deal with this issue. Yeah, Japanese knows all too well that kanji can prove confusing. So to combat the confusion of kanji, another 4th kind of writing system was created. A kind of language which helps and guides Japanese readers through kanji, and even other words they may not be all that familiar with. And this guiding language is called Furigana. Okay, so calling it a 4th writing system or even a language probably isn't the most accurate, but I'm probably going to call this video Japan's guide language or something like that, so I needed to mention it here. If I call this video something else entirely, then that's completely pointless, so never mind. A more accurate term for Furigana would instead be a reading aid, and it exists to aid readers who are struggling with specific words and symbols. The name of Furigana translates into meaning something along the lines of annotating kana, which is very fitting with how it is used, as we shall see. The word of Furigana is written like this in Japanese and is made of 3 kanji symbols and 1 piece of hiragana, which shows us why this reading aid needs to exist in the first place. It's also known as yomigana, which means something along the lines of pronounced kana, and also known as ruby. More on that name a tad later. The main purpose of this reading aid is to guide readers in how kanji symbols they're not familiar with are pronounced. So how exactly does this quote-unquote guide language work? Is it written in yet another syllabary of Japanese or something else entirely? Well, thankfully not. Furigana simply uses the hiragana characters, though in some cases katakana or even the Latin alphabet can be used. And the furigana is simply placed either to the right of the kanji if the script is vertical, or above the kanji if the script is horizontal. Modern Japanese can go both ways when being written down, which is a whole thing we've covered in a separate video about written language directionality. So say an example, you see a sign in Japan with this kanji written on it. As someone still figuring out Japanese and grasping the plethora of kanji the language has, you are completely stumped. There's no one around to ask for help, and you have no singles, so you can't Google it or anything like that. All hope is lost until you notice that above the kanji is some hiragana. This is furigana at work, and it's your guiding light in figuring out what this kanji actually says. The hiragana is familiar to you. You know that this one makes a to-like sound, this one makes an u-like sound, this one makes a ki-like sound, this one makes a u-like sound, and this one once again makes an u-like sound. Say them all together and you have a word that sounds like Tokyo. And not only do you know that this is in fact the kanji for Tokyo, but you in fact getting closer to the capital of the nation. This is a prime example of how furigana is used. Those unfamiliar with these characters can use furigana to sound out the kanji, though I imagine most Japanese people would probably know the kanji for Tokyo. Yet even if they didn't, now they know it, it could help them out next time they come across this symbol on a sign, or even see those kanji characters being used in a different context. Furigana has been around for quite some time in Japan too, originally written out by hand. While I'm sure people do still do it like this, it seems that many devices like word processors, an example, are able to do it automatically, with the furigana sitting neatly over the symbol they're being used to help people with. The exact location of furigana seems to be a big deal, with its Wikipedia page having a whole entry discussing its alignment rules in typing. But what you really need to know is that it goes on top of the kanji it represents. I'm sure you don't mean to go on a whole typesetting tangent, that wouldn't be too exciting. In Japan itself, furigana is mostly linked with kids. Children learning how to read for the first time often helped along with furigana. It's seen in kids reading books at school, and even appears in manga aimed more towards younger children. Apparently in Japan, hiragana is the first script that kids learn, then they move on to katakana and kanji. This means that furigana could even be used on top of katakana words kids might not be familiar with. Hiragana on top of katakana helps these kids come to grips with the other syllabary of Japanese. These kids have a huge amount to learn, that's for sure. But furigana is used with way more than just children. It can be seen in public places, on signs at train stations for example. Many place names in Japanese are written with unique kanji, so if you live in Osaka, for example, you might not be familiar with the kanji characters used in somewhere like the Nagasaki tram line or the Kyoto metro line. Having furigana on these signs once again helps those unfamiliar with these place names in kanji, especially for tourists who don't speak the language at all. The rarer kanji will almost always have furigana above them too. As mentioned, there's tens of thousands of kanji symbols. In Japanese schools, kids are taught the joyo kanji, which means the daily use kanji. This is a list of 2,136 symbols that the Japanese government have agreed upon are the key ones that everyone needs to know. While 2,000 plus is still a huge amount to remember, it's far from all of them, meaning it's inevitable that kids and grown-ups will come across kanji they weren't taught in school. Luckily, furigana comes to the rescue in these cases. Some kanji characters can also be pronounced in different ways, with furigana once again being able to clear up how a kanji symbol is pronounced in that specific context. Furigana is a shining light in the stormy seas that Japanese can be, helping natives and non-natives navigate this seriously confusing tongue. While it has ample benefits, there's one drawback I noticed about it. While it can tell you how a kanji character is pronounced, it doesn't really tell you what it actually means. Going back to our Tokyo example, while its furigana tells you the sounds of these symbols, and you could work out it's pronounced as Tokyo, it doesn't tell you what Tokyo actually means. Like, it doesn't explain how it's the name of a city or anything like that. Once again, you kind of just need to know it already. And I guess this is an issue from my perspective, as I don't speak Japanese. If you already understand hiragana, then I imagine most furigana makes sense. It is a reading aid after all, not a translation tool. Also, that's just my own musings on the matter. If there's something I've completely overlooked and it does help explain what words mean, please let me know down below. Beyond this, however, furigana is a really helpful thing. So helpful in fact that Japanese isn't actually the only language to feature a reading aid like this. Similar aids are featured in other East Asian languages like Chinese and Korean when it comes to understanding their logograms of Hanzi and Hanja respectively. They work in the same way, using the language's phonetic syllabaries to guide readers through their logograms. Collectively, these kinds of reading aids are known as Ruby characters, Ruby texts, or Ruby words, which finally explains to us why Furigana is also known as Ruby. See, I promise you we'll come back to that. I find this name of Ruby word really pleasant. Rubies are really precious things, and these reading aids can be equally precious for those trying to decipher these logograms. Yet this isn't why they are named after these valuable red stones. This name instead seems to relate to the world of typography. Man, I tried to avoid the topic, but here we are. A ruby is a British term for a typographical measurement. It's roughly 1/13 of an inch. This is the spacing that was given between a kanji symbol and the furigana above it. So the word was applied to this kind of reading aid. Why was this measurement called a ruby in the first place, however? Well, according to the Dictionary of Typography, the two measurements between a ruby are called a pearl and a diamond for some reason. So calling this one a ruby was just keeping to the nomenclature which had already been established. And yeah, it's seemingly just a coincidence that these typographical measurements share their names with three of the best games from one of Japan's most beloved exports. Japan and the Korean Peninsula, which in modern times houses the two nations of North and South Korea, have had a long interconnected history of one another, as well as being pretty geographically close to one another too. In many cases, locations that have deep historical and geographic ties tend to have similarities in their languages, or even have languages that relate to one another. Take the Romance languages an example. They all come from the same root language of Latin, which formed on the Italian peninsula, and the nations that speak these languages like Italy, France and Spain, all pretty close to one another. So is this the case with the languages of Chinese, Japanese and Korean? They too are all close together and have a shared history, so it would make sense if they all came from the same language family, right? Well, in short, no. But also, yes, they do have one specific common bond which we'll get to. These three languages are from completely different language families. Take Chinese an example, and yes, I know Chinese isn't one language, is instead a collection of different languages and dialects which are similar but also slightly different, like Mandarin, Jin and Wu. But there's a standard form called Standard Chinese, and for the sake of this video, we're going to refer to Chinese as a singular language. Anyway, Chinese comes from the Sino-Tibetan language family. This family also includes languages like Bai, spoken within China, and the Tamangic languages spoken in Nepal. Japanese is from the Japonic language family, which also includes the Ryukyu languages which are spoken on Japan's southern Ryukyu Islands, and Korean is part of the Koreanic language family, which also includes the Teju language spoken on Teju Island. So not only are they not related, they all come from relatively isolated language families. They are the largest languages of their respective families, with the other languages within it being spoken by much smaller groups of people. This is quite unlike other language families originating parts of Asia or Africa or Europe, where they have many widely spoken languages. But yes, they are from completely different language families. Japanese is just as closely related to Chinese or Korean as it is to German or Hungarian or Swahili, as they are not related at all. Though I ought to mention that there is a theory that the Japonic and Koreanic language families are part of a larger family called the Altaic language family, including other families like Turkic and Mongolic. Yet this idea is highly debated. Wikipedia even refers to it as highly controversial on their page right under its name. Man, you know it's got to be controversial for Wikipedia even saying it. I've never come across a controversial language family before. That could have a whole video unto itself, so remind me to do that at some point. Whatever the case, it seems odd that these languages aren't related at all because, well, look at them. These are signs from China, Japan and South Korea, and they all look so similar. So how can they look so alike and not be related? Well, it's all because of that one thing they do actually have in common, that being a shared writing system. All three of these languages in their written form use a common writing system to varying degrees. That writing system being a collection of thousands of logographs. For those who might not know, a logograph is a written character that instead of representing a single sound, like the characters of the Latin script used in languages like English and French, they instead represent entire words or ideas. While used in all three languages, these characters have their ultimate origins in China with the Chinese language, and from here they were borrowed and used in Japanese and Korean. These characters don't have one name, they instead go by different names depending on what language they are being used in. In the language they originated from, Chinese, they're known as Hanzi, though I also heard it pronounced as Hanzi. They are also simply known as Chinese characters, but I'll be calling them Hanzi when talking about them in relation to Chinese. Hanzi in Chinese is super old. In fact, it is considered one of the oldest writing systems in the world. We have evidence of it in some form coming from over 8,000 years ago, with a more uniform version of it sprouting up around 3,000 years ago. We don't know how exactly it came into being, but one myth on its origins has a literal four-eyed historian, Kanji, inventing them. While the Chinese language and its writing system was being formed, so were the languages of Japanese and Korean. Yet for a variety of reasons, while these languages were being spoken in Japan and Korea, they didn't have a writing system. That might seem odd now, but many languages actually go some time without a means to write them down. This could be because the original speakers of a language had no means to write it down, or they simply just didn't need to. Though of course eventually Japanese and Korean would need some kind of writing system, but instead of creating their own unique scripts, they simply borrowed and used the script which was being used in nearby China, which they had communication and relations with. Korean seemingly adopted these characters first between the 3rd and 4th century, while Japanese adopted them a tad later in the 5th century. This might sound odd, but languages sharing a script is fairly common. Think of all the languages that use the Latin script in their written form. In these other languages, these characters received new names. In Japanese, they're known as kanji, and in Korean, they're known as hanja. Despite the 3 different names of hanzi, kanji, and hanja, they are the same thing. The same characters written in the same way with the same meaning in each language. Take this character an example. It simply means fire. A Chinese speaker, a Japanese speaker, and a Korean speaker will all know that this symbol means fire in their hanji, kanji, and hanja respectively. But while they know it means fire in their respective languages, how they would actually say their word for fire out loud is different. If being read aloud in Chinese hanji, it will be pronounced as ho, while if being read aloud in Japanese kanji, it will be pronounced as hi, and if being read aloud in Korean hanja, it will be pronounced as hwa. Granted, they all sound a little similar and my terrible pronunciation probably isn't helping, but you can hear there is a difference. This difference in the way these symbols sound in different languages is because, as mentioned, they are logographs. These symbols do not reflect sounds like the symbols of the Latin alphabet. Take this symbol an example. If you see this symbol in a word of English, French, or German, most of the time it's going to be pronounced in the same way, making a p sound. Logographs, however, aren't bound to a specific sound when being spoken out loud. They just reflect a meaning or a word, and different languages can relate their word for the symbol's meaning onto it, regardless of if it sounds similar to how other languages might say that symbol out loud. When this symbol was created in China, they applied their word of fire to it. Japanese and Korean, however, would have already had words for fire in their languages, just no way to write it down. So when they borrowed these characters from China, they simply applied their already established words for fire to the symbol, which meant fire in the Chinese language. Yeah, the relationship between these languages is really quite surface level. And while they may all use these characters, how often they use them vary greatly. In Chinese, Hanzi is the only writing system. Chinese has no phonetic alphabet or script, meaning they have no symbols that represent specific sounds in their written language. I guess the closest they have is pinyin, which is used to transliterate Chinese words into the Latin script. This means that Hanzi is used exclusively for all written language needs. This means Chinese people have to know an awful lot of symbols to get by with reading. One source says an educated Chinese person will know around 8,000 characters of Hanzi, but for day-to-day use, they only really need to know between 2,000 and 3,000, which is an awful lot more than the 26 letters of the Latin script. In Japanese, however, kanji is used quite a lot, but not exclusively. It is instead intermixed with Japanese not one, but two other writing systems, hiragana and katakana. These are two syllabaries of Japanese, meaning they are symbols that match up with sounds. Hiragana is used for native Japanese words, while katakana is used for foreign words brought into Japanese. Both these symbol systems actually derive from the Chinese characters too, aka Hanzi. Hiragana is actually an adaptation of something called manyogana. This was when Hanzi characters were first used in Japanese in the mid-7th century, but slightly adapted to present sounds instead of single meanings. This eventually evolved into modern-day hiragana. Katakana was created more directly from Chinese Hanzi in the 9th century. The three writing systems that Japanese implements is something we've talked about quite a bit in various videos in the past. In Korean, however, hanja is hardly used at all in this day and age seemingly. It is apparently still taught and understood, but is very much on the way out of fashion. What is instead used used way more often in Korean is Hangul. This is a phonetic alphabet exclusive to Korean, which features symbols that represent sounds. Hangul has a really interesting story behind it. For the longest time, Hanja was the main writing system of Korean, yet it was only used by the higher-ups and elite of society. In the 15th century, however, King Sejong of Korea wanted this to change. He wanted the masses to be able to read and write in Korean, not just the upper crust. So he decreed that a new writing system should be made, one that's easy enough for anyone to be able to learn, and this eventually became Hangul. This alphabet only has 10 vowels and 14 consonants, and is seemingly one of the easier languages to learn, all because the king wanted people to be able to read and write. How nice of him. Yet, even after the creation of Hangul, Hanja was still seen as the go-to writing system for the affluent, with Hangul for the peasants. I guess the joke is on them now, as Hanja is on the way out in the land, and Hangul is seemingly here to stay. What this all means, however, is that Chinese, Japanese, and Korean aren't related or sibling languages. It's more like Chinese is the cool older kid who gave the younger kids of Japanese and Korean a neat toy or something to borrow, but they never gave it back. There is, however, a third younger kid in this analogy as well, as one other language uses these characters in their written form too, that being the language of Vietnamese. Yep, these characters can even be seen in the language of Vietnam too, and once again they have their own unique name in the language, that being Chu Han. So the question shouldn't be a Chinese, Japanese and Korean related, it should instead be a Chinese, Japanese, Korean and Vietnamese related. And the answer to that question is still a resounding no. Vietnamese is part of the Austro-Asiatic language family. It's not Sino-Tibetan, Japonic or Koreanic. It just happens to use these logographs too. It's a country made up from a variety of cultures, from the indigenous people in the land to the descendants of colonists who have made the land their home. This melting pot of cultures can be seen in the languages spoken in the States, and how they are developed into their own unique variations. This is apparent in the American English which dominates the land, or even the Spanish spoken by groups of people too. Aside from English and Spanish, there is another European language that has taken on a life of its own in the land of the free, that being French. French colonization of the USA and the Americas in general doesn't seem to get too much of a spotlight when compared to the British or Spanish colonization in the land. Their biggest claim on the continent was not in the USA itself, but in its northerly neighbour of Canada, where French is heavily spoken in certain parts of the nation. There's also French Guiana too in South America, which is literally a part of France, like they have the euro and everything. In the US itself, however, French isn't an official language of any state, though there was French colonization, and variations of French is/was spoken in the land. The French colonization of the New World started in 1534. This was after the Spanish arrived in the land but before the British. French claim in North America expanded quickly, culminating in the formation of New France, a territorial claim that spanned from the south of the modern USA all the way up into the northeast of modern Canada. New France was a huge chunk of land, yet the French would lose control of this land in 1763 in the aftermath of the 7-Year War, which saw most of this land handed over to the English. This of course had an impact on the language spoken here too, with French losing out to English. The French would go on to claim more land in the States later down the line, but that too would be sold off to the USA eventually in the famous Louisiana Purchase. The impact of the French on the USA has left the nation with two dominant varieties of the language. Most noticeably is Louisiana French, with 200,000 to 300,000 speakers under its belt. This version of French can be found in the state of Louisiana, the state that is most commonly linked with the French rule of the US, and is often linked more specifically with New Orleans and the Cajun people of the state. The other dominant form of French found in the USA is found on the other side of the nation, in the northeast with New England French. This language is believed to have 170,000 speakers and can be found in the New England region of the nation. This version of French has close ties with the French spoken in Canada, which makes sense seeing how close these countries are to one another geographically. Together, these two variations of French have around 500,000 speakers in the States alone, yet there are also much smaller variants of French which originated from the States too. Some of these variants are so small that they're actually on the cusp of dying out completely. One of those being the variation of French this video is all about, Missouri French. It is also known as Pawpaw French too, in ode to the pawpaw fruit which grows in the area the language was spoken. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why am I making a whole video about Missouri French, a language barely spoken that no one really seems to care about, as opposed to one of the more popular versions of French like the one spoken in Louisiana or New England? Well, it's because I spent the last week in the state of Missouri, primarily the city of St. Louis. I went to the Gateway of the West to catch up with my friend and podcast co-host Paul. Suffice to say, I had a wonderful time, took in all the sights, watched the Cardinals play, and ate way too many toasted raviolis, gooey butter cakes, and Ted Drew's concretes. If it wasn't for a friend living there, I can honestly say I probably would have never gone to St. Louis. It's not a city on many Brits' itineraries for the USA, but I'm so glad I did. Hello if you're watching from St. Louis. Though despite everything I got to see in St. Louis, something I didn't see at all were people walking down the streets having a casual conversation in Missouri French, and that makes sense. As mentioned, this is a language on the cusp of death. A language cannot be about to die without once truly being alive, however, and Missouri French used to rule the roost in this part of the world. Not only was it spoken in St. Louis and Missouri, but the wider area, which was called Illinois County while it was under French control. Of course, that name is now just used for the state next to Missouri of Illinois. French arrived in Missouri from two directions, the north and the south. French speakers in what is now Louisiana ventured north to the land, and French speakers in modern Canada came southwards, both following the Mississippi Valley. The main reason French settlers came to this land is for the natural resources the land had to offer, in this case a valuable lead and a mineral called barite which is found in the region, the latter of which has the nickname of Tiff in this land. Why this mineral became known as Tiff in Missouri, I have no idea, but what I can tell you is that there's a small town in the state that is simply called Tiff, and it was named in honor of the stuff that was once mined here. Interestingly enough, linguists believe that Missouri French has more in common with New England French and the French spoken in Canada compared to the French spoken in Louisiana. It is also pretty different to the French spoken in France, aka French French. If you are able to speak French French and heard Missouri French, then you may be able to understand a good amount of the words, but not all of it. This is because Missouri French was influenced by a huge selection of other languages too. English of course helped shape it, and in some cases English words are thrown in when talking in Missouri French, but also some more unique languages got thrown into the mix too. Various Native American languages helped form it too, due to the French speakers in the land living alongside various tribes. It is also heavily inspired by various West African languages too. This would have been due to the West African communities who came north from places like Louisiana, who in turn could have possibly come from places like Haiti. This means that there are certain words in Missouri French that differ to what they are in French French. Take a word like potato. In French French it is called pomme de terre, while in Missouri French it is called a patata, much closer to the English version of the name. Likewise, cars in Missouri French are chars, while in French French they're called voitures. While it's easy to presume that these variations often don't stray too far from the language they derive from, that often is far from the case, and I'm sure you can see from these examples. In the past, Missouri French would have been one of the most spoken languages you'd have come across in this part of the USA, yet in our modern day and age, it's getting harder and harder to come by. It started to dwindle in popularity at the dawn of the 20th century. This was due to the stigma that French had picked up in this part of the country. By the early 20th century, the USA was a firmly English-speaking nation, and while the language has never been official in the land, it was seen as the only correct language you should be speaking. Those who spoke Missouri French were often bullied and portrayed as being dumb or even less civilized people than those who spoke English. There are stories of kids getting told off by their teachers in schools for speaking Missouri French. In fact, English became the compulsory language of schools in Missouri around this time too, meaning if kids were not able to speak and learn in Missouri French, its ability to carry on being spoken widely were greatly hindered. Thanks to all of this, the number of Missouri French speakers dropped dramatically over the course of the 20th century. In the 1920s, there were reports of around 600 different families that were able to speak it. By the 1980s, however, that number had dwindled to just 600 or so individuals. Today, however, there's even less speakers than that. We don't have an exact number, but many theorize there could be just a few dozen people left alive who speak the language, many of which are older people, meaning the language could potentially die with them. What's especially interesting, however, is where exactly these people can be found, as they are not seemingly spread across the USA or even spread across the state of Missouri. Most of them instead reside in one small town named Old Mines, which is around an hour away from St. Louis. You don't get more literal of a town name than Old Mines, named because in the past this town was exactly that. A mine. I wonder what it was called when it was new. Just mines, I guess. Anyway, this town came into being due to the aforementioned lead and tiff which was mined heavily in this area. Missouri French was able to maintain a stronghold in this tiny town due to the fact it was relatively isolated from the wider world, meaning the language could carry on being spoken and not get as heavily affected by the wider world like it did in more connected cities like St. Louis. Though eventually old mines would get more connected to the wider world thanks to better roads and more advanced technology. This means that even in old mines, Missouri French is on the way out too. It's not like everyone in this town exclusively speaks Missouri French, I'm afraid. You could go there and only speak English and be just fine. In fact, that is exactly what I did when taking a little road trip to old mines to check the town out for myself. And as a Brit who loves all things small town America, I can confirm that it was as wonderfully quaint as I expected it to be. It's clear to see that they are very passionate about being the last bastion of Missouri French, with many signs in the town being written in the language and sites that highlight the town's history and linguistic importance. They even have an annual Missouri French festival. They had a French heritage seminar recently, but annoyingly it was on the Saturday before I got there. This small town is well and truly doing its best to help save the language, and there's even people in wider Missouri doing their bit too. In 2015, two people set up a 5-week course on the language in hopes to teach it to more people. And musician Dennis Strothmat plays in a band which sing many songs from Missouri French origins, helping spread the language through song. The work these people are doing will help keep the language alive, in some capacity. It's pretty unlikely that Missouri French will ever be spoken as a first language by a large community of people ever again. This part of the USA has seemingly moved very much on from being French speaking, but this at least allows the language to be recorded, spoken, sung, and remembered in some way, shape or form. That's a fate a lot of other languages unfortunately don't get to have. And to think, I probably wouldn't have ever thought to talk about this language if I didn't end up ever going to St. Louis. So thank you so much for having me in your wonderful city. Go Redbirds, or whatever I'm supposed to say. I don't know, I'm still trying to figure out how baseball exactly works.
Japan and the US state of Hawaii are similar in a lot of ways, both home to breathtaking natural beauty, highlighted by mountains, luscious greenery, and eruptive volcanoes, as well as both being home to unique cultures that thrived in isolation from the rest of the world. Yet, there's another way in which they're connected, and it's a little bit odd, to say the least. There's this really odd link in their languages. Now, okay, before you think I'm going to try and clickbait you with some nonsense, I know these languages are not related. Hawaiian is a Polynesian language and part of the wider Austronesian language family, while Japanese is part of its own Japonic language family, which contains a few other smaller languages. Do not fear, I'm not going to try and give you all some crackpot theory where I try and say they're actually connected or anything like that, but there's something weirdly similar between these two languages and I just need to talk about it. I have wanted to highlight this for some time now. Over the years I've made multiple videos about Japan and the Japanese language, and a couple videos about Hawaii and the Hawaiian language. I've even talked about the link between these two before in an incredibly niche video looking into how one of Japan's biggest cultural icons ended up shouting the name of a Hawaiian king every time he uses his signature move. Every time I've ended up in a Wikipedia wormhole in relation to either the land of the rising sun or the Aloha state, I've been taken aback by this strange similarity between the two languages, and I'm seemingly not the only one, as upon researching this video I uncovered various articles and forum posts asking about it too, so I promise you, I'm not going crazy. So if they aren't related, then how are they similar? Well, to give an example, let's look at the two names of Kahoku and Kikiha. These are both settlement names and they look and sound somewhat similar to one another. It would be easy to presume that they are from the same country and language, but of course that isn't the case. Kahoku is actually the name of a city in Japan, while Kikiha is the name of a town found in Hawaii. Yep, despite sounding like they come from the same language, they're from two completely different ones. And this isn't the only example of town names sounding similar between the two. Take the Japanese Makawa and the Hawaiian Makina, or even the Japanese Hanawa and the Hawaiian Hana. There's even words like I, which sound the same in Japanese and Hawaiian but mean completely different things. Love in Japanese and food in Hawaiian. Though personally, I feel love and food are one and the same. Even the most well-known piece of Hawaiian, their greeting of aloha, sounds somewhat similar to the Japanese greeting of ohayou. Okay, granted they aren't identical, but they sound way more alike than bonjour and guten tag, which are both
both from the same larger language family. As I told you, I'm not going crazy here. There really is this weird similarity between the two languages, which is only confounded by the fact they're not only not part of the same family, but they are literally separated by the largest ocean on the planet. What on earth is going on with these two languages then? Well, the reason they sound so similar to one another is because the thing they do have in common is a similar phonology. Phonology is the part of language which is all about sound. To study phonology is to study the sounds a language makes, as well as the similar sounds and speech patterns that occur within a language and across a variety of languages. Each language has its own phonology, some way more distinctive than others. Some languages can be recognized by their phonology alone. I'm sure we've all heard an Italian impression, where the person isn't actually speaking any Italian, but just making sounds that sound Italian. That's phonology at play. Oh man, I should make a video about Italian phonology, so someone add that to the list please. But phonology can explain to us why languages sound similar to one another, even if they aren't related. And that's what's happening here with Japanese and Hawaiian. This similarity in phonology between the two languages means that both Japanese and Hawaiian have very similar rules and features when it comes to their sounds. In example, both languages have the exact same set of 5 vowel sounds, with A making an like sound in both, E making an like sound in both, I making an E like sound in both, O making an like sound in both, and U making an like sound in both. Other features they share are things like words never ending in a consonant in either language, syllables being only 1 or 2 letters long, and syllables always having to end with a vowel sound. It's these rules which explain to us why both Japanese and Hawaiian words have that ba 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 sound to them, for lack of a better word. What this means is that a Japanese speaker with a good understanding of the Latin alphabet and romanization should be able to read a Hawaiian word fairly easily, even if they aren't exactly sure what the word means, and vice versa for a Hawaiian speaker reading romanized Japanese. Though to stress again, these languages aren't interchangeable with one another, nor mutually intelligible, like how the languages of Scandinavia are an example. They're not mutually intelligible because, once again, these languages are not related. Yet, while the languages might not have a shared history, the lands in which these languages derive from have an incredibly interesting shared history of one another. There is an extensive history of Japanese migration to Hawaii. Even to this day, Hawaii is the US state with the highest population of Japanese people. The earliest known of migrants from Japan to Hawaii were recorded in 1868, though it's highly likely Japanese people visited the land prior to this in some way, shape or form. It was in this year that around 150 Japanese people made their way to Hawaii. This was during the first year of Japan's Meiji era, and these first settlers were known as the Ganon Mono, meaning first year people. At this time, it was actually illegal for Japanese people to travel abroad, meaning these first migrants were actually illegal. Nevertheless, the two places formed a good relationship. This means that there have actually been Japanese people living in Hawaii before Hawaii was even a US state, as that happened in 1959. It was just a couple decades later when Japanese migration really took off. In 1885, around 1,000 Japanese people made their way to the land. The main thing that drove this migration was money. Japanese people heard of great work opportunities on sugarcane plantations in Hawaii. People from Hawaii were even sent to Japan to try and persuade young men to come over and work. Many Japanese men worked intense jobs cutting sugarcane, and many Japanese women became picture brides, meaning they were married off to men who had only seen a photo of them. While it was tiring work, the Japanese people integrated well in Hawaii, with many Japanese customs, traditions, and foods becoming a mainstay in the land. Buddhism became popular there, with the Buddhist festival of Oban becoming a huge deal in Hawaii, even to this day. Likewise, many Japanese restaurants and stores opened up too, as well as Japanese language schools. Even simple things like mochi, the Japanese sweet treat, has taken on a life of its own in Hawaii. This smooth integration, however, took a turn during the Second World War, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This led to many of the Japanese people in the USA being looked down upon, and tensions between Japanese Americans and other races living in the land ran high. This anti-Japanese sentiment was rife on the mainland USA, especially on the west coast. Hawaii wasn't as bad seemingly. The Japanese there had integrated themselves into American society quite well by this point. Yet still, many saw them as potential enemies on the islands. Thankfully, anti-Japanese sentiment in Hawaii and across the USA seems seems to be dwindling. Today, Japanese people are one of the biggest ethnic groups in Hawaii, and at some point in its history, the largest group. And beyond Japanese people living in Hawaii, a huge amount go there on holiday. It's become one of the most popular tourist destinations for Japanese people, with the nation holding the islands in a special place in their heart, having a deep love for this island state. There's a couple reasons why I wanted to talk about the shared history between Japan and Hawaii. First off, it's really interesting. Secondly, it helped pad out this video. And thirdly, it has led to Japanese influence on the language used in Hawaii. While Hawaii now mainly speaks English, with Hawaiian words thrown in, many Japanese words have found themselves at home there, even beyond the Japanese words that have cemented themselves in wider English like karaoke and manga. Wikipedia has a whole list of Japanese loanwords used in Hawaii, featuring words like benjo, meaning toilet, teiko, meaning octopus, and even jankenpo, the Japanese term for rock, paper, scissors. I even found this glossary of Hawaiian Japanese first published in 1990, which features words like abacado for avocado, hausu for house, and nasubi for eggplant. This shows us that the Japanese language has most certainly had an impact on Hawaii, but those phonological similarities between the languages definitely predate that 19th century arrival of Japanese people in Hawaii. So while we've established that there are some really odd similarities between the two languages, what we really need to ask ourselves is, why? How did these two languages so far removed from one another end up sounding so alike? Well, in all honesty, there probably isn't no real answer. The idea of people from either of these two places visiting the other in the distant past on a tiny seafaring vessel, crossing the Pacific and integrating their languages together sounds really neat, as does the idea of some kind of mysterious secret language we don't know about connecting the two of them, and in turn revealing they are all part of some huge language family we don't really know about. But in reality, it's probably just a coincidence, a sheer fluke of language. There's only so many sounds the human mouth is able to make, so it's not surprising that two languages ended up sounding similar to one another and followed similar phonological rules. And besides, the two languages aren't entirely the same. In example, Japanese has no L sound, while Hawaiian is full of them. They also have different word orders, with Japanese going subject, object, verb, and Hawaiian going verb, subject, object. But the largest difference has to be their amount of native speakers. There are thought to be around just 2,000 native Hawaiian speakers, while there are about 120 million native Japanese speakers. Hawaiian really needs to up its game, or Japanese really needs to calm down. But anyway, while nowhere near related to one another, or even identical to one another, these two languages, whose respective cultures and peoples have had a long, loving shared relationship, are undoubtedly really weirdly similar. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into it, who knows. Mutual intelligibility is when languages have enough in common with one another that speakers of each language are able to communicate with one another to varying degrees of success. I've always found this incredible. We often think of languages as somewhat closed systems, a group of speakers who can use one language and can't interact with another group of speakers. This really isn't the case, however. Many languages have a shared history of origin with one another, coming from the same forebear language, or having interacted with another language for so long, words and terms have become intermixed between the two. This has led to many languages having way more in common than you might think. Take Spanish and Portuguese, or even English and German. People who speak Spanish and don't know Portuguese might understand more words in the language than they realize. Likewise, many English and German words are pretty similar to one another. Yet, some of the languages most renowned for their mutual intelligibility are not a pair, but instead a trio. Those being the Scandinavian languages of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. These three languages are shockingly similar to one another, sharing many similar words, phrases, and grammar rules. Take their word for dog, hund. This is the same in all three languages, minus some pronunciation difference between them, but we'll cover that down the line. Even some whole phrases sound alike. Take the Swedish phrase of hej padig, which translates to mean hello to you. In Norwegian this is hej padang, and in Danish hej medig. On top of this, they all have the same word order too, all going subject, verb, object. This means that if you can speak Swedish, then you'll be able to get by pretty easily in Norwegian and Danish too. There's a lot to unpack in all of this. First off, what even is Scandinavia and why does it only apply to these three countries/languages? There are other nations out there that often fall under the Scandi umbrella but technically are not part of this trio. To be considered a Scandi country, you have to meet two criteria. You must be in the same geographic area and speak a language from the same origin. These three fit this bill, so they get to be in this fun little group. and this is why other countries like Iceland and Finland aren't part of that group. Iceland speaks a language from the same origin, but is far away geographically, and while Finland is right next to them, their language of Finnish is from a different origin entirely. Don't feel too bad for them being excluded, however, as these two, the Scandinavians, and some others are all grouped together under the term of the Nordic countries. So what exactly is it that binds the languages of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish? It's the fact they are all descendants of the language we call Old Norse. Old Norse is the quintessential Scandi language of the past, the language of Vikings, and originally written in runes which now look so mysterious to us. Of course, I doubt it was called Old Norse when it was being widely spoken. That would have been odd. In the Middle Ages, it was known as the Danish tongue, or Dansk Tonga, maybe because Denmark was the first of these nations to gain significant power on the world stage, so the language became most linked with them. And while Old Norse is old by its very nature, it was actually the product of an older language known as Proto-Norse. Proto-Norse emerged in around the 1st century AD in the land of Scandinavia as an offshoot of Proto-Germanic. Proto-Norse developed into Old Norse in around the 8th century AD. Old Norse will not only make itself at home in Scandinavia, but all across Europe. Its key speakers, the Vikings, travelled the continent far and wide, bringing their language with them. This is why the influence of Old Norse can be heard in languages like English and even Russian. At points, it was the most spoken language in Europe. The widespread use of Old Norse, however, came to an end for a variety of reasons, mainly because other people taking power where Old Norse once dominated, like William's claim of Britain in 1066, supplanting it with French influence. While Old Norse stopped being spoken on the grander European stage, it stuck around in Scandinavia, and in the 9th century AD, before the wider fall of Old Norse, it started to form into the languages we know today. The Old Norse speakers who resided on the peninsula north of modern Germany became the Danish. The ones who lived in the central region of the land above them became the Swedish, and those who lived on the western coast of this landmass became the Norwegians. Today, these three languages, which are the children of Old Norse, make up the North Germanic language family, a branch of the larger Germanic language family, which in turn is a part of the huge Indo-European language family. Yet these three are the only languages which make up the North Germanic branch of this family. There's also Icelandic, as already mentioned, and Faroese, spoken on the Faroe Islands. There was also a language called Norn, which was spoken on the now Scottish islands of Orkney and Shetland. It became extinct, however, in 1850 when its last speaker died. Yet despite these two also being North Germanic / descendants of Old Norse, they are nowhere near as similar to the three we are talking about. This is mainly because of the geographic distance of these places, as well as their island nature, meaning they could evolve in relative isolation, or not evolve in the case of Icelandic. Yeah, modern Icelandic is incredibly similar to Old Icelandic. Many Icelandic speakers can read Old Icelandic text with relative ease. Try getting a modern English speaker to read Old English for comparison. But why don't we go back to the actual similarities between those three languages of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, which this video is supposed to actually be about. When it comes to mutual intelligibility between languages, we often compare just two languages when we look for similarities between them. This, however, isn't the case here. As we're dealing with three languages, we have to look how each different pairing of these three languages work and how compatible they are, and this can vary in many ways between the three of them. Often, these languages are compared to siblings, the eldest of them being Swedish. This is because Swedish, after the three of them, has the most speakers, and is perhaps the country most linked with Scandinavia. The middle child is seen as Norwegian. This is due to the fact that in some ways it is kind of seen as a middle ground between the two of them, and has a mutual understanding of its older and younger sibling. This of course means that Danish is the youngest child, something of a rebel the grown-ups don't understand, especially its oldest sibling of Swedish. So let's compare Swedish and Danish, the oldest and youngest sibling. These two are similar, as siblings tend to be, but they are far from identical. Many of the words in these languages are spelt slightly differently and pronounced slightly differently. There are comparisons online of Swedish speakers saying Danish speakers speak as if they are drunk or have a potato in their mouth. This implies that to a Swedish speaker, Danish might sound like someone trying to talk Swedish in a highly slurred kind of way. Take both languages' words for badger. While they look fairly similar, they aren't spelt in the exact same way, nor are they pronounced in the exact same way, with the Swedish word being gravling and the Danish word being growling. While these differences aren't huge, in the context of Scandinavian languages, they are quite far apart. How well Swedish speakers and Danish speakers can understand each other, however, can vary too depending on where they are from. Swedes who live closer to Denmark are probably going to be able to understand Danish better than Swedes who live in the nation's far north. The sibling comparison seems apt here. The youngest and oldest oldest sibling can often be born years apart, sometimes being from completely different generations. It's understandable why they might seem so different to one another. Thankfully, however, to bridge the gap between these two, we have Norwegian. Norwegian is seen as the middle child for this reason, as it has similarities between the two of them, meaning it can communicate to some degree far better than Swedish and Danish can on their own. Take Norwegian when compared to Danish. Once again, Norwegians can often feel that Danish people are slurred in their talking, and that's because the two languages also have pretty different pronunciations. However, they have a huge amount of similarities in their written form. Many Norwegian and Danish words are spelt the same way, but pronounced differently. Take their word for Monday. As you can see, they are spelt the exact same way, but they are pronounced differently. The Norwegian one is pronounced mandag, while the Danish one is pronounced menda. Because of this, I read that it makes more sense for Norwegians and Danes to communicate with one another over text as opposed to actually talking to one another. The reason Norwegian and Danish have such similar spellings comes from the fact that between the 14th and 19th century, Norway belonged to Denmark. Danish was the written language of Norway, so the spellings kind of merged. Bokmål, one of Norway's two writing systems which was adopted post-Danish rule, is actually heavily influenced by written Danish. On the opposite end of this spectrum, we have Swedish and Norwegian, which, if you couldn't guess, sound similar to one another, but many of their words are not spelt the same. Take both their words for train, tåg. They sound the same but are spelt slightly differently. In Swedish it is T-A-G, while in Norwegian it is T-O-G. This similarity in pronunciation but lack of similarity in spelling comes from the geographic closeness of Sweden and Norway, sharing a key border with one another. Yet the spelling doesn't match up because, as mentioned, Danish had more influence over the spelling of the written Norwegian language. It all feels like a bit of a rock, paper, scissors scenario, or like Pokemon type compatibility. But in summary, Swedish and Danish contain different spellings and different pronunciations, Norwegian and Danish contain similar spellings and different pronunciations, and Swedish and Norwegian contain different spellings but similar pronunciations. And when I say different pronunciations and different spellings, those differences are only marginal in many cases. Make no mistake, these are three languages that are highly similar and mutually intelligible for one another, that being thanks to their shared history, with them all deriving from that same language of the Old Norse.
Most countries in Europe have what I'm going to refer to as an eponymous language. By that I mean a language that is the main tongue in the land, originates from there, and its name is similar to the land's. For example, in France they speak French, in Poland they speak Polish, and in Norway they speak Norwegian. From this school of thought, you would presume that Austria speaks a language called Austrian, but that isn't quite the case. For those unaware, Austria can be found in Central Europe to the east of the Alps, definitely not in the south of the world. That's a different nation with a similar name. It's somewhat on the smaller side, with a land area of just over 30,000 miles squared and a population of around 9 million. For context, that's just over 1 million more people than who live in New York City. What it lacks in size and population, it makes up for in beauty, from its wonderful natural beauty to its elegant cities of Vienna and Salzburg. The country has produced some world-renowned people too, from composer Wolfgang Mozart, actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the Ling-General himself, Gunther, or Volta, depending on your preference. It's also the birthplace of another guy who I aren't going to mention directly by name here for monetization reasons, but I'm sure you know who I mean. While it is a land full of things that are definitively Austrian, something that isn't quite as unique to the nation is its language. The official language of Austria is in fact German, as in the tongue which shares its name with Austria's western neighbour of Germany. This makes Austria one of the few European nations to not have its own eponymous language. Well, kind of anyway, we'll get to it. In most cases, when a language deeply linked with one nation ends up as the mainstay of another nation, it's because people and speakers from one land ended up migrating to another land and went on to become the dominant speakers there, like we see with English in the USA, Portuguese in Brazil, or Arabic in Morocco. So you may presume that's what happened in Austria. German speakers from Germany waltzed into the land, ousted the natives in their language, and placed German as the top tongue. That isn't the case at all, however. In fact, it's quite the opposite. German is more or less the native tongue in this land, and for much of history, the land that makes up modern Austria and modern Germany were ruled together as one singular entity by various German-speaking powers. This is even reflected in that name of Austria. It comes from the German Österreich, which translates into meaning the Eastern Kingdom or Eastern Realm. This reflects the fact that Austria was once the easternmost point in a larger German-speaking land. Of course, today it is no longer the eastern portion of a larger power, but instead its own thing.
This name alone shows us that Germany is a country that has shifted its borders in the past. Countries changing their shape and size is no new thing, but Germany takes this concept to a whole new level. Germany might possibly be the European nation that has moved its borders the most. In fact, the current shape of the country only came into being in 1991, when East and West Germany were finally reunited after many decades of being separate nations. Germany's fluctuation through the centuries kind of boils down to the fact that it's really something of a hodgepodge of land, which in the past lacked borders entirely. Lands that could be considered German, or more accurately Germanic in the ancient past, was the large area of Central Europe that housed various smaller tribes and kingdoms. A key thing these places had in common was the language they spoke. German, or at least a precursor or variations of German. One unified German language didn't come around until much later when Martin Luther more or less created it. It's a whole thing. This German-speaking land in the past included the land which is now Germany, but also Austria too. As I mentioned up top, Austria has more or less always been German. German as a name for a language predates German as the name for a nationality by a long time. Yet today the term is equally linked with the language as well as the people from the country of Germany. As we shall see, however, the concept of a singular country called Germany is a fairly recent invention, and calling this singular country Germany kind of makes it seem like the definitive homeland of the German language to us in the modern world. And it can make it seem like other German-speaking nations like Austria are speaking an immigrant tongue. This really isn't the case at all. The homeland of the German language far outstretches Germany's modern borders, and of course it includes the land that is now Austria. This also doesn't make people from Austria German by any means. Their demonym is Austrian, and on the whole, they speak German. Calling an Austrian German is like calling someone from the USA English because they speak the same language. It's not the correct thing to do, nor is a particularly wise idea in some cases. It would take some time for all this Germanic land to come under the rule of one power, and while there were smaller Germanic empires in the past, the one that really took off in a big way was the Holy Roman Empire. From that name alone, you may presume they speak Latin or Italian or something, but no. This was a Germanic empire with a Germanic tongue. The Holy Roman Empire is a seriously complex thing. It wasn't particularly an empire in the same way OG Rome was. One source sums it up while saying the Holy Roman Empire was neither a nation-state nor indeed a conventional empire. Instead, its inhabitants were unified for a web of legal rights, and oh man, there's nothing that excites me more than the idea of a web of legal rights. The origins of this empire are a tad up in the air, but most sources agree that it came into being in 800 AD, when the king of the Franks, with Frankish being a Germanic tongue, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by then Pope Leo III. By this point, Western Rome had ceased being for centuries, but his legacy as a great empire had sustained, and the idea was to bring back Rome in a new way. Beyond this, however, there's very little connection between the original Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. They were just using an established name to get the idea off the ground and so more people understood what their aim was. Kind of like when they turned Doki Doki Panic into Super Mario Bros. 2 in the West. At this point, Charlemagne already had a fairly sizable empire, known as the Carolingian Empire, which spoke a variety of Germanic languages. This empire then morphed into the basis of the Holy Roman Empire. German became the de facto language of the Holy Roman Empire, and as we can see from maps of the Holy Roman Empire, it contained within its borders the land that makes up both modern Germany and modern Austria. This allowed German, or once again its forebearers, to be spoken equally in both parts of the continent. The Holy Roman Empire made a huge impact on Europe, not only in its size but also in regards to how long it was around for. This web of legal rights lasted from 800 AD all the way until 1806 AD. That's over 1,000 years, which is pretty impressive to say the least. How could an empire this large, that lasted for so long, come to an end? What kind of person would be able to do such a thing? Oh, it was Napoleon. Yeah, everyone's favourite not actually that short person was the man who destroyed the Holy Roman Empire. His mighty French Empire saw the Holy Roman Empire dissolve, and from here we start to see the modern nations of Germany and Austria form into their modern shapes in their locations. Shortly after the Holy Roman Empire came to an end, the Austrian Empire rose from its ashes. This contained modern Austria as well as much more land. They would follow their own path and eventually join up with their neighbour of Hungary to form the dual monarchy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Empire, which too wouldn't last forever, and the nations would become separate once again, with Austria eventually coming to its current shape. Germany, on the other hand, would eventually go back to being a variety of smaller powers, many of which were around during the time of the Holy Roman Empire and were even part of it. One of the more well-known of these being Prussia. Prussia became the dominant German power in this land outside of Austria, and in the mid-19th century, their Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, got to work on uniting all the German kingdoms in this region into a singular nation. There was a debate as to whether Austria should be included in this unification. This is because Austria had for so long been so linguistically, historically, and ethnically tied to the rest of the German speakers. However, by this point, Austria had already joined forces with Hungary and was doing its own thing. The concept of a Germany with or without Austria were dubbed Greater Germany and Lesser Germany respectively. As we know now, the Lesser Germany idea won out, and in 1871, German unification was achieved. This gave us the modern nation of Germany in its first form, where it was known as the German Empire, fittingly because it was an empire united by German speakers. Then from here, after a few wars, some hot and one particularly cold, Germany's borders would change to shift into the shape the nation is today. In short, the wider German-speaking world, which includes modern Germany and Austria, was once a series of smaller kingdoms without formal borders which shared a language. Then it was united, mainly under the Holy Roman Empire. Then when that fell to pieces, Germany and Austria went their separate ways, but still used the same German language as they'd been doing so for centuries before. But even though they both speak German, the versions of German they speak are different. Like with the borders of Germany, the German language itself has had a very undefined history too. Even to this day, while we have standard German, different parts of Germany itself use different versions of the tongue. The version of German spoken in Austria is simply known as Austrian German, and in some cases, just Austrian. So they do kind of have their own eponymous language. Austrian German and Standard German are seemingly mutually intelligible with one another, but they have some key differences. Things such as grammar, word order, and pronunciation are different between the two, and of course each language has its own unique words. While a potato is called a Kartoffel in Standard German, in Austrian German it is called an Erdapfel. Stairs in Standard German is Treppe, while in Austrian German it is Stiege. Even hats have different names, being called Mütze in Standard German and Hüte in Austrian German. Beyond Austrian German, the nation has a couple other unique languages too, one of those being Austro-Bavarian, also known as just Bavarian. This isn't so much a language but a collection of dialects, all stemming from the Germanic language family. It has over 8 million speakers in the nation, and considering that Austria has a population of only around 9 million, it's safe to say it's pretty popular, and it is of course spoken in the Bavaria region of Germany too. There's also the Alemannic German dialects too, which are mainly spoken in the westernmost regions of the country. As Austro-Bavarian, Alemannic, and Austrian German are all Germanic languages, I imagine there is some degree of mutual intelligibility between them all. So while on paper Austria might just speak German, in reality there's a lot more going on in the tongues of this nation, and they do, in their own kind of way, have their own eponymous language.
Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/Name Explain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.